have no idea where this will lead us, but I have a definite feeling it will be a place both wonderful and strange.
Hello! And welcome to the wonderful and strange Twin Peaks Logcast. I'm Kalil, and with me today is the Boxman Love Carl Muppet Baby Chainsaw Hands. To my big head pancake Johnny Cash, whooshes worm hype.
I feel like we got a package deal of like intros from a Costco, and we're just kind of like invited them into our homes. And I don't know, as the Unplugged Professor, how I feel about sharing the space with all this.
Won't have to share the space much longer because we are on the final episode of the Logcast, an episode we are calling the Curtain Call.
Yes, because there's curtains in the Red Room.
Ring, 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 ring.
And
Ring, ring, ring,
the
ring.
calling of the curtains
ring,
goes
ring.
like close.
Ring, 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 ring. Ring, ring,
Kalil,
ring,
could you pick up your own mouth,
ring,
please?
ring, ring. I'm going to pick up my own mouth off the floor because my jaw dropped and I saw how many episodes our podcast has lasted.
Your jaw didn't drop. I think I remember, Kalil, that you and I have been in multiple like back and forths on how proper or improper odd numbers are when it
Yes.
comes to like conclusions or ending things on. And this will be episode 77, which is the greatest victory I could ever have because
Two
it's an
sevens.
odd number.
Two lucky
You can
sevens.
keep pretending. You can keep putting yourself inside this space thinking that you can compromise with this. But I do believe that this at least is my moment.
What a strange flex and hill to die on you've chosen. But I guess my feeling is that regardless of the number, I could not think of a better place for us to wrap this up than where we're at. Like, yes, we could continue ad infinitum because Twin Peaks is ad infinitum, all the things that are out there. But I feel like in terms of what we set out to do when we first began, having this be a podcast where a first-time listener experiences all of Twin Peaks alongside a veteran going through a lot of this for the second time, we've done that. We completed the goal. We got to the final dossier, all the books, all the shows, every official piece of media outside the board game, maybe.
Sure, we went through like the trading cards, like
Yes.
But at the same time, Kalil, isn't there like an official VR game out there? Maybe. At this point, we could continue stretching and clawing, and don't get me wrong, there's a value in doing that. But I do feel like this is the natural conclusion to this journey. I feel like, at least for myself, a sense of accomplishment that we got here. Who could have thought so? After hearing our first episode, which you and I, if we were to listen back on it, would just kind of make cringy faces at each other and acknowledge the growth that we've had over this time. But who would have thought when we first started out bushy-tailed, and I don't know why we had tails, and bright-eyed, and having our 50-minute podcast that would balloon into 3-hour monsters. Now,
Not sponsored by the energy drink.
It's something that we didn't know how things would go or how things would balloon. I know there were multiple instances where you and I had to go back and forth, and I was always on the line of, hey, if things get longer, that'll be A-okay. Just because that's just how our discussions got. They got longer, they got more elaborate, we fell into it. We started this podcast for the audio interface, which usually is where I would plug in a microphone.
I think you're unplugged. Isn't that your name, the Unplugged Professor?
Doesn't mean I can't plug in other things. It was like a
Hold on.
Scarlet
Hold on.
2i2. It was a Scarlet 2i2. Thank you. With a singular condenser microphone. This was like before I had any idea of... Yes, you keep demonstrating on our new tech. We upgraded, but no, we started on a Scarlet 2i2. We ended up going on a singular condenser microphone. This was before I had any idea of like what microphones were, what instances would be best for this. In short, like, you and I started just because we wanted to make things, both like the Twin Peaks podcast as well as the Utna video series, one in which we are much further on than the other.
I won't spoil which one.
But regardless, it was something that I remember. We currently have a longer table. We have a Rodecaster Pro. We have 2 separate microphones, dynamic for the respects that we're able to handle our audio separately much easier. And there's a lot of things that we learned along the way. But I remember beforehand, we didn't have a table. We had like this end table, like something you would mount a television on, a very square, I think it was like a 3-foot by 2-foot end table where we hunched over the singular microphone like it's the single warm candle in the middle of a blizzard. And that's how we started. And I'm still surprised by these 77 episodes, mostly because it's something that I could not foresee during our time starting things out. Of course, like, how far can you really see when deciding to take on a project this big? Like, even like the size of the project didn't seem that big in the past.
Yeah, you thought, just watching a show? The show ended after 2 seasons? That doesn't sound so bad. So bad.
But 77 episodes, even if we take like an average and we say that somehow like the average comes out for 2 hours.
Right. Which I think it'd be a little above if we did the math.
It would be a little
Math's
bit
way
above.
too hard for me to do, but...
That's like over 140, maybe close to around the 150 hours if we're being gracious for the averages there. 150 hours worth of podcasts. We have cultivated over the past 3 years over, at least over like what seems to be like 5 days worth of like going in a row material if someone decided to do a speed run through our podcast. Just constant listening, and I think that's just big, at least for me.
Well, even just starting out, I was so nervous to really do a lot with the audio and kind of the hardware and software side of it, that a lot of this was done by you, Professor, at the beginning, where it was your tech and you were doing all the editing, and I just kind of like came up with notes, and then I trotted on into the recording session, like you said, huddling over the little candle warmth that was the recording. But now it's kind of gotten full circle where now I have the Rodecaster in front of me. Still your tech, you're graciously letting me use, but I'm the one operating the soundboard because clearly I am very responsible with it.
Very responsible, as we keep seeing.
But also, like, I've been able to learn how to use Audition and all the Adobe, products to make the editing through the audio. And that's been a great journey for me to kind of grow and learn some of those basic skills that I didn't have to do. And I also didn't have to pay like a college for a class for that,
No, it was something that you ended up picking up eventually, and I know that there was just points that things were rougher inside my life, and I know that you've picked up onto the editing now. Like the Snake Eye Dreams channel, if you haven't had the chance to check it out, if you just like listen to our audio podcast, Kalil has been kicking ass and putting all sorts of things together whenever it comes to all sorts of pieces of media, when it comes down to music, whenever it comes down to certain video games, a type of manga. Genuinely, like, Kalil is basically the lifeblood of the Snake Eye Dreams channel, and personally, if I might say, thank you very much through the hard work that you've put through this. It's fantastic to see, and I imagine
time you finally recognize
only in this moment
vast talents and my incredible humility.
And it's all gone now.
It's all gone.
All the respect I had for you, it's gone.
It's kind of incredible it lasted this long. I do want to also bump you up here too. If you normally listen to this through like an audio interface like Spotify or Google or Apple or whatever, and you don't ever check out the YouTube uploads of ours, I get it. Like, you don't. A lot of people don't go to YouTube to listen to audio. Usually, you go to audio programs, but on the actual YouTube uploads for these episodes, at the beginning and the endings especially, the professors put a lot of work in over these past 3 years to have like very memorable and kind of experimental intros and conclusions. So whenever I pop in or whenever we pop out at the end, there's a lot of work put into some of those. So we don't normally brag that up, but I think you've done a good job with those as well.
It was always a sense of, more than anything, it was never a sense of quality, it was more a sense of experimentation throughout it, just because I've learned a heavy amount of things throughout this time and years, so whatever I had the chance to sort of like play around with, I just had fun. There was a time in which I thought, oh, maybe codes might be fun, but gave that up almost immediately just because I just kept it as a little Play-Doh playground.
Mm-hmm. And this is obviously like the most loaded question I could possibly ask you right now, or at least among the top 10 most loaded questions I could give you right now. But this was your first time going through Twin Peaks.
It was.
Now that you've fully come out the other side alive, intact. Your soul may have been utterly annihilated along the way. I don't know yet, for sure.
Not because of Twin Peaks, but yeah,
Just
absolutely.
in general?
Just in general,
Life.
that's life.
Frank Sinatra.
What?
So, that's life. Anyway, so my question for you, Professor, again, super loaded as a baked potato. How was Twin Peaks?
Twin Peaks is something that's going to be a very specific journey for me. It's going to be what this podcast was, and no matter what, I will not be able to untie or unravel.
I can't get it out of my head.
It will be symbiotically connected in that respect.
So I was doing Batman. I probably should have gone for Venom, according to what you just did there.
It is something that I think I'm still going to explore in the future in my own personal time, Dr. Jacoby style, but it's not something that I think that I necessarily need answers anymore on. I think that just the journey itself is very nice. I've made the metaphor before, as I'm bringing up 15 different ones right now, is that I take this journey as a series of train stations. Though this train has gone on for 3 years and I started working on it for a little bit and made sure the upkeep was nice, eventually we reach our destination, and it's something that this journey is just something that I'm going to look back on very much so.
See, just like the train in Snowpiercer, it's incredibly long and full of peril, but at least we reached our destination. Come on, Snowpiercer train. Get to where you're going. You just keep going around and around the globe.
I've never seen Snowpiercer, but I hope it makes it there one day.
Or read. It's a book.
Or read.
Comic?
Nope. Audible.
It's a comic book.
I have to audible.
It has
that comic
artwork.
book.
I think okay, anyway. for me, this has been, for the most part, a second experience of a lot of Twin Peaks. And through this, I've definitely developed more of an appreciation for a lot of aspects of Twin Peaks, especially The Secret Diary of Laura Palmer. I would say that this has been a real turning point for me to really realize how much I value that book in the Twin Peaks canon. And I just find myself bringing it up so often. I don't know if that struck you, Professor, but I feel like throughout the Return's entire discourse, I just keep going back to the diary as sort of a counterpoint. And one of the things that I think is so beautiful and maybe a bit underrated about Twin Peaks, and on the same note with kind of some of my stronger opinions, this, of course, has been great for me to better understand and maybe better articulate some of my critiques that I've had over the Return and over the Mark Frost books, which I can't say my opinions have changed a ton the second time around, but I understand my feelings better.
I remember when we were about to get into the Return and so on, and there was a bit that you couldn't really hide per se, but there was still like the idea or essence of, I hope going into it this time.
Right, I really did
like,
hope.
You were trying to put your best foot forward. It just didn't work out as your best foot forward.
Right. And with all these things, right, with going through these first-time events for me, I had never read the Access Guide. I never read My Life, My Tapes, the Diane cassette, the card art, or, of course, the Gazette, which I got for this, the copy of that. All the special features, never saw any of those. All this, like, new material and looking through the David Lynch films and dissecting them, I've enjoyed getting to look through, this is the wrong metaphor. I was going to say this minefield. I was going to say like this mine, like I'm mining out the ore of goodness, but then I said a minefield instead, which is there's things under the ground that may be true, but they are going to explode when I touch them.
It's content that you didn't expect to be as expensive as this, and you are left wholly on fire.
What's left of me? What's left of me? But no, it's been good. And I was kind of mulling this over too, where I'm of the opinion you can't ever fully explain Twin Peaks. I don't think that Twin Peaks, really any of the media, any of the official media, has like an official explanation that you could like figure it out. You crack the code. We're done here, folks. You can go ahead and hand in your punch cards. So it's like I could see an argument that people should just enjoy it on their own. There's no point to having all these people talk about it because it's better if you just form your own opinions, because that's a big thing with David Lynch media is like discovering it for yourself, forming your own conclusions, kind of making it personal.
Bring on your own friend for a podcast that'll last about 3 years and then elaborate on every single detail that you can find.
So that's the question is, what's the point of doing this if there are no answers to, at the end of the day, say we're confident 100% on? I personally believe that there is still a purpose to that. not necessarily to explain everything, but I think that the more you share these ideas and the more that you engage with others in terms of this media, I think the more enriching it becomes. At least in my experiences, learning about the behind the scenes, learning about all like the facts and even the contradictions of the facts behind the scenes helps me appreciate the show more. It doesn't take away. It never feels like, oh, now I know how it's made. I don't want to have the hot dogs anymore. If I was use a metaphor here, I feel like knowing how it's made has been more interesting with the process. And as well as like diving into all these areas in which we've discussed over these course of these 77 episodes, it creates this conversation piece out of the show that I find to be not only fun, but again, valuable. So whenever I go back to Twin Peaks, again, I have all these new layers I can build on before. Characters I might have been not thinking as seriously about, now I have more reason to look at. And, I say that about our podcast. I would hope that we've been able to give listeners something like that, some sort of collage of perspectives, some other like layers you can add on. But then I think it's the value of all the Twin Peaks podcasts that are out there. No matter what differences they might have in their form and structure, I think we're all trying to share in this bigger conversation about this show. And I think by sharing in this conversation, it keeps the dream alive.
It's something where I see Twin Peaks as a heavily experimental force that I'm able to dig through, but I do find entertainment and excitement when it comes to a community aspect of it. I've found that working through this podcast with you has not only led to like hours of discussion both on and off pod, but it's also sort of refined my ideas of what I sort of like walk into a show with, what I'm going to explore with that, because I kind of want more material that's willing to be experimental, such as what we've seen through this. And we do have points where like things become more experimental as we continue to see more media pop up from time to time. But a lot of influence that we see in these styles and shows, a lot of them credit shows like Twin Peaks or Twin Peaks itself, and for good reason.
And not even just the shows. I think it's incredible when you look at the books. Like, that's just not a thing I hear done very often. Something like releasing The Secret Diary and My Life, My Tapes and The Access Guide, 3 very different books in their tone and their style and their presentation.
Yes.
All within a short period of time while the show is still kind of going. And it's like those become this very interesting part of the media. It's not a retelling of like the story, like a lot of adaptations are. It's expansion. And I just don't know of that happening in as many places. I mean, there's things like Star Wars with their expanded universe, and don't get me wrong, that is very interesting. I do find that very cool. But outside of like Twin Peaks and things like Star Wars, I don't know as many pieces of media that do this, let alone a show that only lasted 2 seasons. Having like this vast wealth of supplementary material is really interesting. And then like you said, the legacy it carries on for shows like Lost, shows like Psych, et cetera, et cetera.
No, it's heavily expansive, and not only that, there's still plenty of love that seems to go on from time to time with it. A lot of it is more so classic Twin Peaks love. I've seen about 100 different references whenever it comes to red curtains and chevron floors, but it is still very there and apparent and a lot of fun.
I think The Return, since it's still newer, hasn't had as much time to be referenced, obviously. I think that people who are going to be influenced by The Return years later will call back to it in their own ways once the legacy of the show's more cemented.
Dougie Jones.
The only real reference I'm aware of, and I'm sure there are more, I know that Suda51 in one of his games had a reference to Twin Peaks The Return, at least one reference. I won't spoil that for any Suda51 fans out there in the video game world.
Scour the library after the release of The Return. You'll find it maybe eventually.
It'll narrow down. And I've made no mistake that obviously the original series is where my heart tends to go back to. But really with Twin Peaks, what I'm after are characters. It's probably with all media the thing that I am most interested in. Some people are lore junkies. Some people are really big on like the music or like the main plot. Those are all valuable, great things. I'm a character junkie.
There's many pieces to this pie. Some people like crust, some people like filling, some people like the tin.
What are characters? I think they're the filling.
I think that they are the fruit in the filling.
I think so.
I think that like the gel or whatever you call it, like the jelly that's
Laura
around
Palmer.
the fruit. The gel and jelly are like the motivations to keep them together, to have them stick,
right,
and make sense within the pie itself. Because otherwise, you have just a bunch of like weird assorted fruit under this crust.
So the return is a lot more of an experimental pie, right? In terms of its structure and infrastructure.
But regardless, the fruit are there. That's where the juice comes from, and that's where like you can probably get a lot of appeal. This is why you come to the pie. Or a lot of people come to the pie, I should say.
Yes. So I want to talk about our favorite characters in The Return. Now, for this, obviously new characters from The Return are eligible here. I would also say it's fine if it's a character that was in the original show, as long as we're talking about them in The Return as being what's so good about them.
I've challenged myself, and only by mostly technicality, to try to stick with just The Return for this list.
Okay. So I did not hold myself to that standard.
That's fine. There's my standard. You can't have it.
Interesting. So I did a top 5.
And I did a top 5 because Kalil told me so.
I did. So my number 5 is Margaret Lanterman.
Okay, so
yeah.
We're talking about Margaret Lanterman as she is through these bits of dialogues that we get from Hawken herself with the phone calls and so on. Tell me, like, as far as it goes, is it just something that's more so a sentimentality with the character? Is it something where, like, you are seeing the performance? Because the hardest part, I think, that one has to contend with, and there can be a larger ethical question to it, or you can just sort of like see it for its beauty, is that this literally is someone dying, and is someone who will shortly after the recordings of these die.
I mentioned it before that I think if there was ever like a reason or justification to pull out for why The Return exists, I would say that the farewell kind of goodbye moment with Hawk, and by extension the sheriff's station, to the character of Margaret Lanterman in The Return is the justification. I think that moment alone, to me, makes The Return, I don't say worth it, but it kind of gives a reason for this to exist. Because there are a few characters more vital to Twin Peaks and its iconography and its sort of messages than Margaret Lanterman. In the original show, she was always kind of on the fringes. Really, the majority of Margaret Lanterman content we see in the original show wasn't in the original show when it aired. It was added a few years later by David Lynch with those intros.
Yeah, and honestly, I know this is going to be an odd sentiment, but if we had like a talking person who is going to mention things from the show and just speak somewhat from a director's perspective, I kind of prefer like taking the perspective with Margaret Lanterman with David Lynch, sort of like fusion words, rather than Gordon Cole. But that's just me. Don't mind me. I really do enjoy the Log Lady intros.
And I think that she takes on this obvious important image in a lot of the books, in Fire Walk With Me, kind of with her warning to Laura. And for years, like behind the scenes, the actor Catherine Coulson keeping that log. And I think to have her in The Return be this character who has all of this advice and perspective, and to tribute her in such a way at the end, I think it's quite beautiful. And I think with the performance, I've also said that before, I don't judge it as a normal performance, because this is not a level of emotion that you can just fake. This is the performance of someone who is dying, knows they're dying, but wants to be part of something they genuinely loved. And for all of the actors who unfortunately could not participate in The Return because they had passed prior, I am very glad that The Return was made early enough that Catherine Coulson could be part of it. Because I think if it had been made even a year later and Catherine Coulson couldn't be a big part of The Return, I think that would be one of the saddest tragedies you can imagine for the show.
I see.
I think that even though screen time-wise she's not big in The Return, I think her like impact on The Return can be felt really resonantly.
I think that there was just a lot of love from both the cast and crew whenever it came to not only the character but also the actress, that having moments like these became all the more important. And I'm wondering how much, say, for example, moments such as the goodbye continually was then fueled beyond with editing and further filming with, again, the context of what happened shortly after.
Because, the Margaret Lanterman stuff would have been some of the earliest material shot for The Return.
Yes.
My number 4 character is also a returning original character, and that is Bobby Briggs. I wonder maybe if I made this list a little bit earlier, I would have swapped and had Bobby be 5th. But really, our recent conversations have made me bump Bobby up because I've taken more of an appreciation for what he's doing in the return.
I want my Bobby up, Bobby up, Bobby up, Bobby up, Bobby up, Bobby up ribs, but the ribs are like the tier list.
I obviously really like Bobby in the original show. He's probably a top 5 character most days of the week in the original show for me. But I like in the return that he is a character that feels like he has an arc. That a lot can be implied, I think, in between season 2 and the return to make sense of why he became a cop. I think it's not hard to imagine he wanted to try to help people who suffered like Laura did or like himself. And he takes on this mantle. Then to see him years later in this place of relative stability, in this place where he's trying to make the best of he can with things with Shelley and with his daughter, I think he has a genuinely interesting character. He isn't just a cameo. He isn't just kind of a one joke kind of character. He feels like he's really doing something in the story. He has some agency and some moments in the spotlight with the Jackrabbit's Palace stuff. And I think the performer does a really good job kind of growing into what Bobby could be like all these years later. He's very different. He's definitely changed, but it never feels like a contradiction or like it doesn't make sense. I feel like it's a natural evolution of the character.
Yeah, I don't think that there's many characters that I think would fit inside the area of law enforcement as much as Bobby does for something as this character's conclusion, if you will. Just because the law enforcement, the building behind it, and also the people behind it were heavily important through Twin Peaks. So to say that there's going to be some form of legacy with that, and then they bring up a recurring character for that, I think that not only is it an exciting take, but I think it's just something that is fully evolved for the character, especially when it comes to some more final conclusions with that character, as well as his daughter later on, and also the conflicts that exist around him, such as what seems to be his ex-wife, or maybe that they are currently seeing each other, but there's that conflict of her potentially seeing someone else, as we saw on his face during that same scene.
I think that even if I had my dream rewrite of Twin Peaks The Return, I don't think I would change much with Bobby.
No.
And that's something I can't say for the majority of returning characters. I thought Bobby was just handled very, very well. My number 3 is the Mitchum brothers. New characters. They're not the original show.
Mitchum brothers? Like, for number 3, like, Mitchum brothers, these are 2 separate characters.
Do you actually believe that?
And you put them into one
Do you actually believe that they are 2 separate characters?
Yeah, actually. I believe that they exist. They're 2 actors.
All right.
There's these 2 people.
You
One
think
gets
you can judge them
by
as
a
remote. You would want me to separate.
And the other has the dream about the pie.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm going to put these 2 Mitchum brothers as one character. Yes, I know that's very much like a gray zone.
It's cheating. It's the gray zone of cheater.
You can try to vilify me all you want, but I think almost anyone listening can understand why I would do that. Because those 2 characters, more than almost any other duo in all of Twin Peaks, maybe more than any duo in Twin Peaks, are inseparable. You cannot separate these brothers.
I demand a petition for you to throw all your sentiment of Margaret Lanterman off this list so you can put both Mitchum brothers at 3.
I am not going to do that. Now, I don't think I have to explain too much. I think they're very funny. I think they're like the most consistently entertaining, humorous element in The Return, a series that I think desperately needed those comic relief moments. I think The Return has such fun moments with the Mitchum brothers, and both those actors do so much to try to like build that off. Like even just behind the scenes, seeing the way in which those 2 performers were kind of talking and acting behind the set. It felt like Jim Belushi was just constantly like trying to do his best with material and improvising some of the emotion as he went along. That scene where he like has the whole pie situation out in the desert, it's hilarious. And also along that side with Rodney Mitchum, the conga line stuff, like having to actually lead that energy behind the scenes was so fun to watch. And I just thought that those characters are very memorable. They're one of the best aspects of the Dougie storyline for me.
Not to mention, I would say that there's also an element that makes them very fleshed out as characters, that we understand where they come from, what their motivations are, how they're being led about, and we have plenty of screen time that gets to explore some of the more intricate things that sort of fold them out. That I don't know many people who are going to be sitting around like, I wonder more about the Mitchum brothers. No, I think we got the complete story right here.
And I think it's an interesting almost subversion because when you're watching The Return, if you're very familiar with Twin Peaks and David Lynch's films, he has a lot of situations of a shadowy like mobster or like a shadowy person in the criminal world. And they typically play, although they are different between each other, typically play kind of similarly, that they're very malevolent and dangerous. And the Mitchum brothers, yes, they do put hits on people. They are dangerous. They're dangerous. But to then develop them into comedy relief, lovable goofs is such a bold choice for David Lynch and Twin Peaks. And it's an interesting, again, subversion of something like a Jean Reno or a Ben Horn.
Just Dale Cooper just saying you're good people after a few hours ago in which they were about to, at gunpoint, shoot him down if it weren't for the pie.
And it's like the more you interrogate, the more absurd that becomes. But you can't help but, I think a lot of people can't help but love these guys, even though, they are hardened killers and criminals.
I think that the truth is, even with these issues of the Mitchum brothers, I think that just adds to the Mitchum brothers in general.
There's a contradiction that's so absurd and funny with it. So big fan of the Mitchum brothers. My number 2, maybe on a given day, could switch with Mitchum brothers for number 3, and that's Sarah Palmer. This is a situation where I've gone back and forth because I never want to vilify or just turn Sarah Palmer into purely a monster. I think that has some harmful messaging, in my opinion. However, yes, Professor, you're making a weird face at me.
Did I assist in this list?
You definitely assisted.
I did it, folks. I convinced Kalil of something.
So I definitely am more looking at Sarah Palmer now, as the Professor would say, as a sort of Frankenstein's monster situation, where she's kind of been in this position of fear and suffering for so long in a way that's very alienating from the world. And I think there's so many ways you can read into her character that are very complex in terms of what she's going through and what she is. She's not a predator trying to seek out prey like Bob. She's someone who is trying to keep the world at bay, but as a result of that, quietly suffering. And it seems like there aren't many people trying to help her or really understand her pain. And those that do, she's maybe trying to keep them from harm's way as well. Mm-hmm. So I think that Grace Zabriskie does so much with the few scenes that she's given.
Yes.
It's pretty harrowing because we've seen Grace Zabriskie in the original series. We saw Grace Zabriskie, excuse me, in Wild at Heart, as well as in Inland Empire. I think that's everything we've seen her in with David Lynch. And while she does consistently a good job, this for me is easily my favorite Grace Zabriskie performance, is Sarah Palmer in The Return.
Okay.
I think that there's a level of tragedy and menace being fused that you just don't see very often from any performer. And I think it makes her delivery something I would keep wanting more of. Not too different from how I always wanted more Ray Wise, right? More Ray Wise. It's like that level of commitment to the character.
Honestly, everyone in the Palmer family have been knockouts ever since Fire Walk With Me. And I would say the elements inside Twin Peaks, though. The only reason why I don't say Twin Peaks in general is because I think early Laura Palmer was a little bit
There was not a full character.
It was not a full character there. And I do think that the performances for Fire Walk With Me knock out her performances inside Twin Peaks.
Absolutely. All three of those performers are excellent. Mm-hmm. My number 1. Do we have a drum roll?
Why do you want to play with the buttons
What's the closest thing to a drum roll we have on here? We've got a rim shot.
That's good enough.
It's kind of like a drum roll. So my number 1 is Mr. C. Is he a returning character? Yes, no.
Yes, no. Yes, no.
It's kind of yes, kind of no.
The loss has happened in 25 years. He's like lemonade, in which you have to let it settle.
The worst lemon.
You can't just lick the lemon directly.
The dark lemon. Forbidden lemon.
Forbidden lemon. Mr. C is the vitamin C you never want in your life.
The C stands for cruelty.
Vitamin cruelty.
Yes. I initially, when I watched The Return, was so surprised about the way Mr. C acts because I was expecting him to be zany, maniacal laughter Red Room doppelganger from the end of season 2. But what I ended up getting out of Mr. C was so good that I'm just you know what? I don't need what I thought I needed. I'm quite okay with this. Would I love to peer into another universe and see season 3 from the 90s happen and see Kyle MacLachlan in the 90s being a zany, over-the-top, Bob Ray Wise level of evil, yes, that'd be very fun. But I think that just the complete transformation that Kyle MacLachlan brings to this character, just everything about the aura. Yes, there's some makeup involved in this, but a lot of it is just his dead eyes and just this sort of cold neutrality that you think could make the character boring in a sense. Oh, he's so lifeless. No, he sucks the life out of everything, and it's so good. It's so good in every scene, in every character interaction. Anyone who's with him, he just has such a way of just cutting through whatever they're talking about and staying on this focused mission. Yeah, I wish I knew what his mission was a bit better. I wish there's some clarity, but I don't hold that against the character at all because he's consistently great. A lot of my favorite scenes in The Return are because of Mr. C.
No, that's completely fair. One thing that I do appreciate from Mr. C, I know you mentioned that you would want to see a sort of zany version of Cooper. I kind of am more appreciative that we got this form of Mr. C, mostly because of my appreciation for kind of a response to past characters. If we had a zany Cooper after having a zany Wyndham Earl,
right,
I do think that there could be some people that might not gel with that as much. Say, for example, with Infinity Train, one of my favorite animated shows, a very fun sci-fi based show. Season 3 went into darker places, and when it came to season 4, I was curious on, okay, where do you go after this? Are we going to explore this and that? But instead, they respond to it in a more uplifting style story that's a little bit more onto the goofy end. And I've come over time to appreciate that a lot more because I do think that story beats, characters, and so on should kind of form this sort of, I would say, natural energy that you're able to bounce from place to place to make things more distinctive rather than dwell in something that is too familiar. It's the again, experimentation that I appreciate here with Mr. C.
Yeah, you never quite know fully what's going on with him, and even just his first appearance with that very dark, slow remix as he's driving through the night. And he just dismantles that guy at the door and just this sense of command and power. I just feel that for as much as I love Dale Cooper, and Dale Cooper is probably still my favorite character from the original show, probably still my favorite Twin Peaks character ever, hard to see that changing. Mr. C is such an interesting and welcome surprise because Kyle MacLachlan is responsible for 2 of my favorite characters in Twin Peaks now, which I think is a great testament considering these characters are almost nothing like each other, despite one of them wearing the other's face.
Dougie Jones.
Dougie Jones. Not my top 5, but that's A-okay.
Yeah, but with top 5, speaking of, you told me that I had to put together a list of top 5.
Did you check it twice?
No. It was a one-and-done situation. It was like...
No regrets.
Just went ahead, typed it, and just went with my ad, and then it looked just like, yep, that's right.
All right.
We're good. And with that being said, it makes it all the more clear when number 5 is Nannybot.
Excuse me?
Nannybot from The Return.
Nannybot.
Yes.
I don't remember that character from the credits. Who is Nannybot?
This is what I'm referring to. And I'm going to explain this, okay?
Yeah, you owe
Kalil?
us an explanation.
I'm going to explain this.
I asked a very simple thing. Who are your top 5 favorite characters? And you invented a fan fiction OC as your number 5.
It is I can't remember the exact quote, but it is the weird glass-balled Johnny's friend.
Oh!
That's just like, how are you doing today, Johnny?
I thought you
just
hated that thing.
I hate it, but I kind of love to hate it. It's like a heel situation where I walk in, it's like, oh, this fucking thing. I look at that and it fills me with rage, but getting that rage out is kind of cathartic. It's kind of nice. Like, it's a moment and it doesn't last as long as other things in The Return, but I'm also not watching Dumbland again. It's one of those cases where I'm getting like Diet Dumbland enough just so I can throw the can and be done with it rather than have to suffer for too terribly long. So Nannybot, as I'm calling them, just because they're checking in on Johnny,
is that a character? Like, we're stretching the definition of character. Like,
we're stretching it.
Yeah.
But does it have a face?
Okay, that's not usually.
Does it have a voice? Was it recorded by an actor?
Wait, okay.
There we go, Kalil. Nannybot number 5. Speaking of things that are going to leave you dumb, land-founded, and also staring at me weird, number 4 is the Mitchum brothers.
Okay, who are those?
They are 2 brothers that are.
You included them as one character? I disagree with that. I think they're 2 different characters, actually.
Now, why do you say that, Kalil?
Well, they have 2 different actors in the credits. There's Rodney and there's Bradley. Bradley's the one who had the dream. Rodney's the one who gets hit in the face with the remote.
In this hypothetical realm, there's enough leg room to like pop the legs out from number 4 into number 5 where Nannybot is. Nannybot won't mind. Nannybot only says one thing, so
I used my number 5 spot to talk about Margaret Lanneman. You used your number 5 spot for Nannybot.
Yes, I did. Aren't you proud of me?
So I'm kind of interested because that's pretty low if you thought you were only doing like new characters in the return.
I was doing new characters and I had to balance through things because, again, I do think that there's some very brilliant standout performances through here. But the first couple that I put into my top 5, in which I think that I would be remiss otherwise, is genuinely with number 5. I just enjoy this sort of like point where I'm sort of like taken aback out of my seat and kind of have to look at this thing.
Yes.
And it's, again, like it's something that I think requires legroom for me, but I also emotionally will probably be excited for that to come. Again, not putting away other performances, which I think are beautiful and wonderful through it, but I have to be true to myself in this respect on like what this means to me personally. Mitchum Brothers as well. Heavily entertaining, heavily fun, and again, thoroughly fleshed out as a dynamic duo. I do think that as far as items are concerned, especially like this sort of like somewhat adopted element, but they're still brothers together that have joined in for all eternity, put themselves all into this business that they have, and yet somehow come out as these great guys. They are just heavily fun, and I can't get over that. But it also is where I recognize that this is the weirdest sort of like high-low situation that I'm having with these picks, because I'm moving on now to the natural conclusion of Goofy Nannybot to very fun Mitchum Brothers to the Fireman, who is also known as someone being very comical and fun. No, the Fireman.
Is that a new character?
The Fireman is a hard pick because it's one of those cases that I'm caught on a technicality. And these last 3, I'm caught on various amounts of technicalities for new characters. The Fireman could be recognized as an evolution similar to the evolution of the arm.
Right.
It could be recognized as a spirit that was always there from within the log. It could be all sorts of matter of things. But at the end of the day, this is a character at the very least has a separate name, takes on a separate tone, and sits inside of a realm left unknown. It is a character that I feel is so much to chew on, similar to the pitch inside of the double R, that I can't help but kind of fall in to these moments through this character, as well as his performance through it. It's a simple performance. It's a performance that we're all very familiar with in the respects of this strange reversed speech, but I do think that he very much owns the environment. He owns his physique, and I think he owns this role very well.
Do you headcanon the Fireman as Margaret Lannerman's husband or the spirit of him?
Yes.
Okay.
I think that it just kind of fits too well. I do headcanon the sense that from within her log, there it is. I do think that the walls look a lot like the log. I think that with Margaret Lannerman's backstory with her husband dying off in that case and her holding the log close to her chest, I think it's just something that fits all too well for me.
What does that make the Milkman? Because they're one and the same, right?
They are one and the same. It's just that he is reaching out. It's one of those cases where I think that the log is that sort of like wise man-based persona that is going to be guiding and helping as far as forces go. And meanwhile, we have this milkman. The only thing that we really get from the milkman is this very smiling figure that moves around, does a simple job, but still is a very inviting force that is going to try to probably... I don't think he even has to try. I think that he is a presence that makes me smile whenever I see him. I think it's the welcoming.
Cooper was smiling when he saw him.
Yep, absolutely.
Through the pain.
Through the pain. But I do think that there was a form of prestige from what I remember reading of the man, the fireman, and how close Margaret Lannerman is, the log lady with him. I do think that there are just like past speckles and pieces of this person brought out upon this world that people were then formed from. People being a log and a milkman.
Fair enough.
Speaking of a milkman as well as people that are formed.
Right.
I'm going to move on to one of my more controversial picks, a person that was formed, Diane.
Oh, okay. What's it do with milk?
It's one of those cases where I didn't actually have a conclusion with milk. It's the latter one that actually makes more sense.
See, I am a master segue artist.
Yeah, cool.
So it's very important of the follow-through.
The milk truck broke down on the way to the Segway.
One could say that milk truck was Diane.
You are crying over the spilled milk. So there you go. You perfected my segue. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Diane, she is heavily complicated inside this role. As you were mentioning with Sarah Palmer in the respects of like how a role is presented and so on, Diane is someone that admittedly is someone very difficult to talk about and one that I myself am less experienced in the pains that this character is going through. However, what the actor's able to bring to the role in each of those moments and how powerful even just small little focal moments. Sure, we have a few seconds of her being like, fuck you, and then having these little like dialogues in sec. But on the other side of that, in the latter end of Twin Peaks, where she absolutely kills it standing outside of the hotel room and also the pain that goes through her face in the scene thereafter, I'm sorry, the actress does an amazing job. The elements of being alive and yet not being yourself and yet having that confusion, her emotions becoming this larger storm was fantastic when she was sitting in with the FBI. There's just so much that goes through not only the fantastical for like driving yourself into that character and seeing where she's coming from, where her motivations are, and what this tulpa is feeling or what may be a lack thereof on feeling, but it is all presented in a package that I think I can't help but have an imprint in my mind for almost all the scenes Diane has in The Return.
No, I mean, I'm with you that Laura Dern did a great job with what she was given with the material.
Yes.
To translate these incomprehensibly like alien realizations. I don't know about you, but I've never experienced realizing I'm not real and I'm not me.
Yep.
I guess you'd say the closest real world parallel would be feelings of derealization or depersonalization,
yes,
which can occur. But I mean, I think the situation she was given is so specifically different that she had to navigate that. And I think she did as well as anyone could, really, in that situation. I guess the question I have is, are you considering, when you say Diane as a character, are you considering that the same character, the Tulpa, as well as the one that we see in part 17 and 18? Or are we separating those? What are you talking about when you say Diane?
I'm talking about the Tulpa. I'm talking about the person at the end. I'm talking about the confusion of who is who when we're standing at that gas station.
Yes.
I'm talking about the full-out package. I do genuinely feel, and I do recognize this is just my personal rating, but when you are someone that has been basically cloned, set with those memories, and then live your own existence for a certain amount of time, you do hold a lot of that character as well as your own character and those conflicts within that is endlessly palpable for my palate to sort of like dig into, explore, and also see how the directors, writers explore it in their own fashion as well. It is such a promising line whenever it comes to sort of character analysis and what this means for the characters within and around that I can't help but very much enjoy Diane.
And of course, very importantly, this was the opportunity for Tammy to say her most famous line in The Return. I think Diane's pretty sus. She might be the imposter. I want to take a moment to recognize that in this final episode of our podcast, I'm going to age it very strongly with my Amogus meme.
You do that as literally, as you said that, this light of the sun shined into my eyes, almost to tell
like
me,
the truth.
like nature.
God.
No, God and nature is telling me to get away, to leave. Number one, the top of my list, the top person at the numero uno spot is Mr. C.
What? I think that is a terrible choice, Professor.
Good, we can have terrible choices together. I think
You're clearly forgetting the superior character that was the brother Fusco number 2.
Nah, I think that just for that, I'm just going to move Nannybot up one more. Just one more little bit higher on this.
So,
this is all you're doing.
Was there anything with Mr. C that hasn't already been said that you want to lavish on top of an already prestigious recognition?
Physicality, the various interactions with other characters, the constant mystery, and not to mention, basically steals the show every time that he's on. Even if a scene takes longer and it has Mr. C into it, I think it's the Mr. C's benefit. I think Mr. C fits so well into the return as far as this series, this limited series goes, that you can't divide them. Mr. C is intricate to it. And I think that that's very much stands out thanks to not only Colin McLaughlin's performance, but also the overarching, I suppose, mystery of Mr. C as he keeps trying to find this Judy situation. He's just not going to be stopped. He is a constant force that keeps potentially being knocked down slightly, but elsewise gets up again, and we're never going to be keeping him down. Until, like, you know, Ace Me Destiny happens, but beyond that...
I think the guy just wanted a signature from Judy Garland. Like, maybe if he got through time, he just got the signature from Judy Garland, smiled, thank you, you're a real icon to me, he just would have left, and he would have gone away, it would have been great.
But we can't leave just yet. We've got certain things that I feel that you and myself need to discuss as far as our positions on things. Like, I know that we've said a lot of things in the podcast, and a little bit of this is going to be a little bit of treading back. But
starting positions? You want to return to starting positions?
Not starting positions, but more so, I want us to take a step back and kind of look at Twin Peaks as a whole. And what we sort of like take that maybe not everyone takes to. What like something that is maybe lukewarm in a take, or maybe sizzling in a take. Maybe let's see, warmer, hot. These takes. I want you to take off my hands a hot take, please. Before we leave, I need to send out to the universe a take that is hot.
Professor, you are in luck. I have one of the hottest takes.
I'm sorry. Why did this make you turn into a wizard? This is the most wizard I have ever seen.
The
you
great and powerful.
We just smoke screen. Ahoy,
ahoy, mateys! I am a wizard of the 7 seas.
Slowly, this podcast is melting into
the scurvy is in my brain, lads.
We left this Hershey bars of a recording in the car too long.
I killed the albatross, and I'm weighed down by its weight. And the weight I am weighing on my neck is the weight of a hot take. Professor, I think it's good that they revealed who killed Laura Palmer. I know. I know. I hardly even believe my own ears as I say the thing that I typed many days ago.
Yeah, you seem amazed by that thing that you usually say. So amazed. Now, why do you say it?
I feel that killing Laura Palmer... That already happened at the beginning.
Why is that so funny?
I feel that revealing.
Why is killing Laura Palmer
that's the
so
first
hilarious?
episode. I meant something else. I feel that revealing the killer of Who Killed Laura Palmer did so much for the series. Did so much for the series' depth and reputation and influence and what it means to people on a personal level, that I think to get rid of that, to never reveal the killer, would severely hurt the show, in my opinion. And hurt not only the show, but the expanded media. Because what this did was create so much depth for the Palmer family and make the story and the mystery of Who Killed Laura Palmer into this really agonizing and brutally real scenario that people, again, were not talking about. There's a lot's been said, even by Cheryl Lee in some of the special features, that people generally do not talk about things like sexual abuse, domestic abuse, and in this case, incest. So to have this story be what it was, one of the worst possible results that could have happened of Who Killed Laura Palmer, it made the entire scenario so much more vital and important. It wasn't just, some random killer. Like, if it had been, like, Leo Johnson, the obviously bad man, the most obvious culprit here, I don't know what the big takeaway would be as much. but it being Leland opened the door for so many other stories. Like, for example, Fire Walk With Me, which many now consider like the best part of Twin Peaks, or The Secret Diary, which obviously I think is beautifully written and has meant a lot to a lot of people, especially young women trying to understand things about their own feelings on sexuality, their own feelings on some of their own family issues that maybe you can't connect to a lot of the otherworldly aspects, but it is actually meaningful to people. And I think that if we just tried to keep the show going forever without revealing the killer, without, revealing the destruction of the golden goose who laid the golden egg, as David Lynch would say, I don't think that would have been sustainable.
Yeah, you are killing the golden goose, and I thought you were a vegetarian.
I think this is one goose that would need to be cooked.
Oh, God.
I really do. Because that created one of the best episodes in Twin Peaks. That episode when Maddie is killed and the Leland's revealed to be the killer.
Yes.
One of the best episodes in, for my money, TV history. Not that I've seen a lot of television. I could eat those words, but I'd be stunned if I could watch 50 more shows, and I probably wouldn't find many episodes as good as that for me.
As someone who watches a lot of television, I do think that I agree with the sentiment. It is something that's very powerful. I think that Leland's actor Ray Wise carries it most certainly, and I do think that it leads to something absolutely horrifying, that if we didn't have it and instead just like was held by the throat by a leash, being like, oh, who could it be for so long, like
this be spinning its wheels.
It's be spinning wheels, and I think that maybe it'll think that that's going to be the better option, but I genuinely do feel that there are so many more fun opportunities to explore when a killer is revealed than it is to constantly like throw the carrot out there and keep pulling at the string. I do think that if you hold yourself to a mystery or a mystery in a box and try to flounder it around for long enough, the interest can wane. It's something where the idea of the mystery can get heavily distracted over times, and I would much rather explore, question, and kind of have fun with the result of the situation. Not have fun in the respects of, oh yeah, I'm gonna go kill off and do all this myself. No, have fun in the respects of having a chance to take this medium, take these ideas, and then possibly find and repurpose them into, say, for example, a deep dive and exploration of someone that is horrifyingly tortured, and sort of like crack open that egg. I want to crack open the golden egg.
I feel that a lot of our favorite Twin Peaks material simply would not exist if they had never revealed the killer. So it's hard for me to say I regret it when so much great content, important content, this took Twin Peaks somewhere it otherwise could never have gone. And I also want to say, if we're looking for shows and examples of something that maybe held onto its central mysteries too long and spun its wheels, I would say that's a lot of the criticism of Lost. A show that we continuously, are reminded was inspired by Twin Peaks. That's a show that had some great, great mysteries at the beginning, many of which continued for several seasons, and then more mysteries got added, and a lot of times, I think for critics of Lost, it spun its wheels a lot. I don't remember. I watched Lost as when I was like a kid. I would need to see it again, and I want to really judge it now. But I want to say that other shows have tried what Twin Peaks would have been if they hadn't revealed the killer, and I don't think it's universal acclaim in how that went. I think that the metaphor I would use, because we love metaphors here on this show, is that no matter how great and big and beautiful your fire is, it's eventually going to burn out if you don't give it new kindling. I don't think the problem was that they revealed Laura Palmer's killer. Because I think eventually, if they hadn't revealed it, it would have died out anyway. I think what you needed was another through line or another idea on the ready, so when the killer was revealed, we have another direction to go. There are already some great sub-stories being developed. Already great characters that I think a lot of audiences would have been interested in.
Yes.
Like, what are you going to do with Audrey now? Turns out nothing. Like, they just didn't know what to do with Audrey. And I don't even think they should have had her with Cooper. I just think there was so much potential with characters like Audrey, characters like Bobby, that you could do something with it. Do something with the Bookhouse Boys. Do something with Hank. Please do something with Hank.
No, you can't. What are you going to do with Hank? Hank was beat up inside the diner. What's left?
Nothing for him, apparently. I just feel that if they had another idea ready, they could have actually continued that momentum. And, I don't want to stretch it forever, but I also think that maybe more time with Ray Wise being the killer, we as an audience know it, but the characters don't, that's still compelling while you're building the next story at the same time. So I feel like there were other options. The show, to me, did not get ruined and canceled forever. Woe is me, because they revealed the killer. Mm-hmm. I think that's good that it happened. Period. Full stop. End message. Then I do the all with the smiley face from the text message.
I'm going to leave you on red. I'm just going to look at that and keep moving forward. It's not because I don't disagree. I totally agree with you. I just
because you don't disagree.
It's one of those
frame
cases,
in the most negative.
It's one of those cases where I think that everything has been said, and if I put a thumbs up, I think that might be insulting. So I'm just gonna let the phone sit down. You sit with your own thoughts, and I will silently agree over here.
What's your hot take, Professor?
My hot potato. Okay, I silently take this hot potato and wince a little bit as I continue to spin my own wheels, continue to spin my own way of saying, Gordon Cole kinda sucks. I really don't like Gordon Cole. It's one of those cases where Gordon Cole, and sparingly, Gordon Cole is salt. Gordon Cole is...
He makes you salty, that's for sure.
Most certainly. He's something that's good in moderation. And I think that the best example of Gordon Cole comes from Fire Walk With Me.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those cases where I think that not only other agents highlight better, but it also, if you're going to include your director role, if you are going to have this friendly little face that's going to be around, it's something that is better in those small cases of moderation. Unless you really want to explore Gordon Cole's darker side and also probably put that into a potential conflict with the rest of the characters, which I do think that if you are the director and you're throwing yourself into the role on, say, for example, playing a character, I think that that's more powerful, I think that's more palpable, and I think that that's something I can handle better than seeing him romance Bobby's love interest and getting a kiss after she's the only one that can hear him. Maybe you can have all the readings in the world onto that. Maybe they had a great time, and maybe they have something that I'm very much clearly missing infinitum. But Gordon Cole otherwise just seems like this one character that has had kind of distracting the moments in the plot where other characters could potentially shine in.
I think that if you were looking for a smaller role of Gordon Cole, we've highlighted this before on the podcast, that in The Return, even if you just had the one scene where it's Albert and Gordon Cole in Gordon Cole's office, and you have the picture of the nuclear bomb on the wall, he's whistling at the beginning, and then Gordon Cole is called out by Albert for, hey, I know you can hear me. And if you had that moment and used it as a setup for Albert being sent on this mission to go find Diane with Tammy if you want, that's all the Gordon Cole I think I would have needed. Really. Maybe the Denise scene if you want. I don't even know if that was necessary. I think bringing Denise in is good. I just think you could have done that other ways anyway.
You could have done it other ways, but also, if it's Gordon Cole, talking to Denise in some form and fashion, and also sort of, going through that briefing and going through the history and also making Gordon Cole questionable, that'll be fine. But I think that that's my absolute limit. I think my Gordon Cole cup has spilleth over after that.
And if you wanted an example of a director self-inserting in a way that maybe doesn't feel as kind of mixed emotions for you, one way that I've seen that done while still keeping it to be a main character was with the film Jojo Rabbit, which is a film directed by Taika Waititi, who in the movie plays one of the least likable, least supportable characters, which is child's imagination of Adolf Hitler.
Like I mentioned before, when it comes to a character that is jumping into the role, having that villain role is very nice. And also, that was the most epitome of evil character you could probably
And also an idiot. In the movie, basically, Taika Waititi characterizes this child's idea of Hitler as this, goofy, over-the-top, stupid character in a way to highlight kind of the falsity of that fascist propaganda, especially what it can manifest to in a child's mind. And that's a case where, I don't look at the director going, yeah, you just wanted to make yourself so important in your own work. No. I think it's one of those cases where he kind of took it upon himself to be the butt of the joke.
And I want to make it clear in this case, I do think that I do think that it's not David Lynch trying to be self-important and being like, oh, yes, I'm going to be in the work and I'm going to be highlighted. I think that the most honest answer I can come up with from seeing David Lynch, from seeing the special features, my own personal reading, is that he may want the opportunity to sit down with the people that he's grown close to and be a part of that larger project with them. I think that there is a bit of poetry that he likes to incorporate himself into this larger project and this piece of work, because we don't see David Lynch that often with his own pieces. This is a very rare moment and opportunity, and I think other people have had a lot of fun with him being there. I just, again, had to be honest with myself in the respect that I just don't really like his acting, and it just makes me feel weird and funny at times. You make me feel weird and funny, David Lynch. I appreciate you, but you make me feel weird and funny.
I don't know if I'm going to make listeners feel weird and funny with my next hot take.
Here's the potato.
Potato. Oh, God!
It's an imaginary potato.
It's the hot spud.
It's the hot spud of your mind.
Scalding tater.
Only as hot as you want it to be.
Okay, cool.
I don't like that sentence, but we're keeping it in.
Okay, good. So, prefacing this one a little, I believe that the Who Killed Laura Palmer mystery is one of the strongest hooks the show could have had originally, because it brought together all of these different characters and kind of linked them in a way. So, for example, Benjamin Horne, you first might be inclined to look at his character and question his character because he was the employer of Leland Palmer. He's an overall shady man. The more you learn about the guy, the more you realize with like One-Eyed Jacks, he might have been Laura's killer. Then you go to someone like Bobby, who, seems like this abrasive, delinquent kind of kid, and he's so aggressive with things. Obviously has issues with his family. But the more you get to know him, it's all connected back to Laura. You gradually are able to tell his own story with Shelley. Almost every character in the original show has a connection to Laura where you're watching them, at least at first, potentially because they might be the killer or connected to the case in some way. Either a suspect or someone trying to lead the investigation. It is a through line for all these characters. Mm-hmm. Like I said before, I think the show could have developed new through lines. I think that Fire Walk With Me and The Secret Diary of Laura Palmer both have an implied through line of what was Laura Palmer like. It's getting to know not who killed Laura Palmer, but who was Laura Palmer. What was her life like? Even My Life, My Tapes, I think, has an implied through line of what is Dale Cooper's past. In the show, he claims he has no secrets. Was he lying? Let's find out. I think that The Secret History, who is the archivist, while maybe a bit obvious of a mystery, I think is still a through line for the whole entire work to really center around, as well as the bigger picture mystery of what is with all this supernatural stuff going on. So my hot take, as my hand burns over with this fire hot uncooked tater tot.
It looks like you're holding the head of a baby more than it is a potato. That's a big-ass potato.
What is a potato if not the baby's head of Mother Nature? One could say.
No one has ever said that.
I have says it.
You are the first.
My hot take, number 2, The Return lacks a good through line or hook. So I do not think there is anything nearly as strong and gripping, especially from the start, with The Return. There are 2 possibilities I can come up with for a through line. Mm-hmm. One would be the obvious if it's called The Return, when's Cooper coming back? That seems to be a driving element of a lot of the story because many audience members are going to be wondering, okay, what, I see Dougie? And everyone's saying things about coffee and he's getting the pie and all this stuff's happening where like maybe something's going to wake Cooper up and he's going to come back. And he eventually does. And he says, I am the FBI, and everyone cheers, and it's great. And then, like, an episode and a half goes by, 2 episodes go by, it's over now. So as a through line, it doesn't pay off until way too late. And in the meantime, does it follow a clear sense of progress? I don't feel like it does. I feel like a lot of times I'm just sitting here watching Dougie do the same kind of, like, I get the joke. Like, it's the same kind of thing over and over again. And it's not really meaningfully like he's gradually coming back or something. Mm-hmm. It feels like we're doing nothing. He's on pause until all of a sudden he turns on the TV or the TV's turned on and it's all of a sudden Sunset Boulevard. Deus Ex Gordon Cole shows up. He plugs the fork in the in the light switch. And it feels like instead of it being built to something, it was just kind of let's do some jokes until we actually get to the good stuff. And another big problem, it doesn't connect anything. Because, yes, there
I mean,
are
it
characters...
connects him to the socket.
It
with
does.
this fork.
There are characters in the Dougie story, but does that connect meaningfully to what's happening in New York, or what's happening in South Dakota, or what's happening over in Twin Peaks itself? Not consistently. I really don't think it does. I think that even the Mr. C stuff doesn't connect everything. It just still feels kind of all over the place. Then the other possible through line I could see doesn't even get brought up like verbatim until way later, but that's who is the dreamer. It's a big question, maybe as big as who killed Laura Palmer in a different kind of way, but it's not said until so late, so you can rewatch the show with that idea in mind. But if you were already like kind of bored by that point, I don't think that's enough to suddenly make everything you've already watched, oh, I see how it all connects now. And that's one, assuming you think it does all connect. I think you can interpret the who is a dreamer aspect as simply being kind of like this idea with like meditation or viewing the world as kind of illusory, that you're seeing through that we're all living in this sort of imaginary world. Doesn't have to be taken literally, but if you do take it literally and you wonder who is the dreamer, yeah, it connects back to a few things. You could connect it back to Jeffries, connect it back to Audrey. But again, it's too little, too late. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's enough to bring the whole show together, and I don't think it's enough when I rewatch it, knowing those mysteries are going to be brought up later. I don't think it makes everything feel like it's part of a whole. I don't think it gives the show an identity or a drive. Mm-hmm. When I watch The Return, I feel like I'm watching a lot of disconnected vignettes, and some of them I really like, some of them I don't really like. A lot of them have great performances, but in terms of a story or character arcs, I am left wanting more.
Just wanting more out of this collage as you step away and don't realize that it's just a big old picture of a cherry pie.
It's just interesting that David Lynch believes that revealing who killed Laura Palmer's killing the golden goose, that's the center of all the mysteries. Yet I struggle to find what the golden goose is in The Return. And maybe you could say that's the point, that it's a show intentionally made without a driving or a hook. Almost, an opposite of Twin Peaks that had a driving mystery from the beginning. I don't think it's especially great. I don't really like that. I don't think it makes for good television, in my opinion.
I don't know if I'd go as far as like it's with the purpose of Without a Golden Goose, but I do see where you're coming from for the respects of having a show that doesn't exactly have that same momentum that having a Golden Goose at the start might have with the original Twin Peaks. But it's one of those cases where I don't necessarily think that The Return really needed one. I don't think that The Return needed us to have a hook that's jumping between these vignettes. I think that if you are to, say, for example, workshop it, I don't feel necessarily the need, but I do see if there's a need for workshop, there's much more pressing issues than there is, say, for example, an underlying mystery that's more attended to. I think that exploring these areas, exploring these vignettes, and more importantly, exploring how these characters and characters' lives interconnect despite their large distances, there's a lot of promise that can come from that, whether you feel that's effective or no. Now, what I find...
Here's a potato. Catch! You did the noise before you caught it.
I knew what was going to happen. The big part about this potato is that the potato is not infinite.
Yeah.
You see that there's one end to the potato, and then there's another end to the potato. And even then, if we are to measure it into some other end, such as its hotness, the potato can't stay hot forever. One day, the potato will cool.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm
with you.
I say all this because I do feel that there is, at the very least, if it's not a hot take, it's still notable with how many people are willing to speak up about their desires for it. And I understand the desire and the want and the wishes, though I don't fully have it myself. I can still, at the very least, empathize with the ideas that Twin Peaks needed to continue in some form or fashion. Is one of those cases, again, I love The Return. But I will also say that when it comes to the ending of Season 2 or the ending of The Return, those are not lacking conclusion. I think that what happens in both of these cases are forms of bad endings in the respects that things go against our characters. And I think that there's a very mature conversation that can come from it, as well as a bit of like hook onto the memory when things do not work out well for characters. I know some people can desire for the melancholic, in which it can be a slight victory, but having devastation as your ending is something very palpable I don't see many places, and I think these endings are going to stick with me for some long time, thanks to how they are. However, a lot of people would want, say, for example, Cooper to continue in some fashion, especially with the Where's Annie matter and breaking his head against the window. Or some people want to know more after the scream has gone through and the character disappears out of existence. I didn't necessarily need any of that. I genuinely think Twin Peaks can just end. And I think that it does well in its format for television to end.
Maybe at first, the endings of Twin Peaks were meant to have cliffhangers to, potentially get a new season, for example. Season 1 ended with Cooper getting shot, and a lot of bad things were actually happening at the end of Season 1.
Yeah.
It's easy to maybe forget that because we got a Season 2. But then Season 2 ends arguably even more devastating for many of the characters. What's worse than getting shot? Having your soul annihilated and you're basically even possessed by Bob, or you're the doppelganger now. All that's gone horribly wrong. Not just for Cooper, but like everyone in the main cast is having a tragedy.
Yes, no, we have Dr. Hayward shoving Ben Horn at a fireplace. We have...
No, that didn't happen. The official records say that it was... he just tripped and they were just having a conversation about Audrey. Didn't you read it?
There can be a fun dissection on that, and we already dissected a bit of that on the podcast over there. There's the element of everything that happened with Nadine reaching its natural conclusion of when the memory comes back and how horrible this situation actually is and how everything crumples down.
The truth shall set you free to cry.
It was definitely a moment to do exactly that. Where Sarah Palmer comes through and there's a much more darker voice that exists within her as she says she's with Cooper in the lodge. There's so much going on that leaves...
Audrey has a blast.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It leaves things at such a miserable note that compared to Cooper being shot and a few things happening there, it feels far less cliffhanger to me and far more devastation.
And somehow the Returns ending, I would argue, is even more bleak than that.
Yeah.
Because you shot the guy, you left him in a red room, but at least with Season 2's ending, there's the idea, well, the good Cooper is still there. He could come back. We just got to get the bad one to go back in and swap them. And if you didn't already kind of get that implication, Fire Walk With Me also has that idea of the good Coopers in the lodge. Then the Return comes around, and we don't know what year it is. We don't know what dimension it is. All we get is a scream and the lights go out. And at least the sense that I get, I don't know all what's going on, but I don't think Cooper's in a better position. I think Cooper's in much worse of a case than simply being stuck in the red room at this point.
It's like a case where, like, you could argue that he's just lost inside this case, like he's in the middle of nowhere, but eventually he finds himself a bus, so there's opportunity to there. But then the Return goes ahead, oh wait, that's not a bus, that's a space shuttle, and shoots him off.
And arguably, not even just for Dale Cooper, him going back in time to bring Laura Palmer back to the place of her trauma in a different timeline or whatever, arguably got rid of the peace and, although very sad, at least end of suffering that Laura went through in Fire Walk With Me, and now has it prolonged. The last sounds we hear are Laura screaming one more time. It's like you made her suffer again. You took away, like, at least the peace she had in Fire Walk With Me. Mm-hmm. So Fire Walk With Me might be the least negative ending Twin Peaks has had on screen, because at least that one ends on a message that she's found peace at last. However you want to define it, I get, at least that's what I get. Is a sense of potentially peace from it.
I can see it.
So the fact that the Return managed to end the story for Laura and Cooper worse than ever, if you continued into a Season 4, what more can you do to them?
Well, I know what you can most certainly do with this podcast right now. Speaking to Kalil, not the listener. Listener, you sit back, relax, enjoy yourself some insert references here, and just enjoy your day, because I'm going to return to more top 5 stuff Kalil made me prepare in the background for specifically this episode, because Kalil really likes lists.
I love lists.
And so one thing that you can do is, when it comes to my 5 return pieces, is maybe you could do something similar to my number 5 pick when it comes to the Return.
For scenes.
For favorite scenes. 5
Yes.
return favorite scenes. Moments inside the return where they are going to be etched into my brain because I'll remember them so well. And the 5th place one is a kid getting hit by a truck.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
Is this because of it you enjoyed it for what you think it was trying to do, or because of like the way you enjoyed laughing at it? What is it for you?
It's more personal than that. For a kid getting hit by a truck. And it was one of those cases where you and I sit down, watch an episode, and I realized something on like how it's clipped and so on. So we took so much time dissecting and laughing and having fun at this very odd moment where like everything's being lifted up in this happy, joyful thing just for Richard Horn to literally smash a child and have them clip out of existence.
Yes. And then a bunch of stock actors show up and look sad about it.
It's something that, for not the intended purposes, I imagine, was something wild, fun, strange that I can't help but not put it on the list. It's something that is going to be very personal for me and Kalil. I will admit to you, listener, I don't usually like seeing children getting hit by cars in the middle of scenes, but this is
the funniest time it's happened on TV for you.
This is the funniest time on TV that it has happened to me so far.
And we should acknowledge that there are people watching The Return who do find it genuinely sad and didn't laugh out loud during it.
And that is fair. That is valid.
It was effective for you.
And I'm glad that it was. It was not for me.
Like a lot of David Lynch art, it evokes varying levels of responses. Like, I'll never understand why people would laugh at Sarah Palmer's reaction to Over the Phone with Flora being dead. I always thought that over-the-top presentation wasn't funny. It was very tragic. But the same way as I don't feel that, other people find that funny. So, different strokes, different folks, shabba-dabba-doo-dah.
You know what you would really feel, though?
I'm feeling it now, Mr. Krabs.
You will feel it now, Mr. Krabs, when I take a remote and smash it against your face. Because
Okay,
at number 4 is the instance where I think it's a bit of the history, but also the tone of the scene when the Mitchum brothers one of the Mitchum brothers, Rodney, I believe it was,
yes,
is just sitting down as Candy goes around, like, tries to follow this fly before smacking him with a remote to remind you that was where he ended up getting hurt during the scenes. And to kind of explain the injury, they literally just had one of the characters smack him with a remote. This scene did not need to be there. Probably this thing could have been covered up by makeup, and that would be just fine. But no, we just roll with it, and it was rolled into something that was a very bright light amongst the various dark tunnels that we've had to face through The Return.
Nothing like more violence that's funny.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of violence that are funny whenever it comes to me considering The Return and being like, this is great. However, you know what's also great? Drugs. That's right.
Oh, I don't.
Drugs are great.
Full disclaimer
So
here that the
wonderful.
Twin Peaks Wonderful and Strange Logcast does not support
Can't get enough.
the use, consumption, or purchase of drugs that are considered illegal in your current area of residence. We are not officially, for legality purposes, ever encouraging this.
Into my soul.
The words of the professor do not speak for Kalil. The words of Kalil barely speak for Kalil. Don't hold us accountable for anything.
Nope, don't do it.
This is all satire. Everything we said is satire. And that goes for everything in the past 77 episodes. All of it is satire and fair use.
Every single one.
And fair use.
And fair use. And royalty free, maybe.
Yes.
I don't know. Re-upload our podcast and steal our work. You can do it.
It'd be kind of funny.
But this drugs that I'm talking about deals with Bobby's daughter.
Okay. Which scene of Bobby's daughter named Becky are you talking about?
The one where Becky is sitting inside the car, partaking on this hit for herself while things are driving by, that she ends up falling back, smiling out, looking up, and this light is hitting her in a way that I almost am reminded by the creepy image from Fire Walk With Me with Laura Palmer.
And Missing Pieces cut, right?
That Missing Pieces cut, but where she is in an absolute end of ecstasy. I think it's well shot. I think it's heavily well framed. I think that the actor does wonderful for that moment, and I think it's a very great setup for the character to come later on. It's just a very solid scene. There's not much that I can say personally onto it, other than if there was one scene in The Return that I can't think of like reworking whatsoever, that I can't think of tweaking, and I can't think of like how it could be done differently, I think that this is one of those solid moments in The Return.
I think it was more of a liquid moment. Maybe a bit gaseous.
But snakes are everywhere. Similar to the amphibian that we find. Number 2, here's a fun one for this, Kalil. 5 favorite return scenes. I've gone through 3. 5, 4, 3.
Yeah.
Number 2, don't judge me. Episode 8 in general. The one scene.
You're actually making this better.
Episode 8.
Because I cheat on one too. I cheat on one too, so that's good.
That's great. I chose episode 8. My favorite scene from The Return in the second place spot is 45 minutes long.
You know, the term scene is really nebulous. You know, what is a scene, really?
What is
a collection of moments.
It's a selection of moments, and I selected all of them. I pressed select all. I copy-pasted it, and it's now my homework. No. It's something where I can't really place it down. I do think that there's something great about episode 8 when you just sort of like sit down and take it all in. I think it's The Return at its best pace when it, like, David Lynch can take his time. And I think it's in every case a work when he's emphasizing himself as a painter. I think that whatever The Return came out to be, it is in service to episode 8.
Fair enough.
It's just a solid time. Any moment that you see from there, absolutely every single moment.
What could even top it?
Number 1.
Am
The
I
introduction
gonna be mad at you?
to the Mom Zone. No, you
Oh,
won't
okay,
be
that's
mad to
good.
me.
That's decent.
It's something where you don't need much. Or at least I don't need much. But having an introduction to a new place, something that is far less familiar than anything else that you've seen. You can excuse, say, for example, a moment with the firemen. If you count that as the Mauve Zone, I'm not counting as the Mauve Zone. It may be in the Mauve Zone, but I'm not counting as the Mauve Zone.
It's distinctly less mauve.
It's distinctly less mauve. But sitting inside that room, it's strange, but you can still connect it to the red room. You sit in the red room, you can connect that to the red room. Believe it or not, connect that to the red room. You see the glass case, you can connect that to some strange oddities. But when you introduce a whole new place, a whole new world, and you pan the camera across the oceanscape, have Dale Cooper drop into this lone place on top of this extremely mountainous area, surrounded by almost nothingness in this light purplish tone, I can't help but fall in love with falling into the zone myself. It's something that evokes curiosity, it evokes my need to explore, and I think that when it comes down to other people, when they want to dissect something that is mysterious, strange, and almost mythological, you can gain so much from the Mauve Zone, even just by this presentation alone, on what it means and what it feels like, and I think that that exploration is very much key to the enjoyment of The Return in general, and one of my points of enjoyment to The Return in general.
See, I thought you were going to say something like really controversial and ridiculous for your number 1.
I put the kid getting hit by the truck again. I put it on the 1st and 5th place.
No!
I had to rewind and bring it back.
I think it's interesting that you chose the Nanny Bot, as you said, as a character, but did not choose the scene with Nanny Bot.
Oh, hells no!
Okay.
I enjoy the character for the moment, but there's just so many better scenes.
Okay, fair enough. I will acknowledge at this point that I did not include Part 8 at all, because otherwise I would have done the exact same thing you did, and I would have had Part 8 everywhere on here, or I would have made it the whole episode on the list. Because Part 8's probably my secret number 1. It's so hard for me to rank anything really above Part 8, but to try to separate Part 8 into pieces, I can't do that. All of it goes together for me, so I understand why you put it as one scene. I made, to challenge myself, 5 that are not Part 8. Don't worry, I still cheat later anyway.
Yay.
My number 5 is from part 4, and this is Gordon speaking with Mr. C. This is the introduction where Mr. C is behind that glass wall, and it's the very awkward thumbs up, the deeply uncomfortable atmosphere of Gordon Cole and Diane talking. I think Diane was there at this point as well, but for sure Gordon Cole, and trying to interact with this entity that is walking around in Dale Cooper's skin. I thought it was such an effective moment to highlight how eerie it can be when Dale Cooper is not there, but Mr. C is trying to do a Dale Cooper. We don't see that very much in The Return. Most of the time, Mr. C is not trying to be anything other than just his cold self. The moment he tries to show any sort of warmth, it's almost worse. Please, just snap my neck or something. Don't smile at me. Please. My number 4 is from part 15. I thought actually you might be going there when you mentioned reptiles earlier. It's Axolotl with Ruby. So it is the Axolotl song being performed while my only favorite, I think, Roadhouse moment happens when this woman named Ruby is grabbed and moved out of her seat and then proceeds to crawl and scream on the floor.
I think that you and I can just generally agree this is just the best moment with the Roadhouse.
Absolutely, not even close, and it works in ways I don't even know I can fully describe. Because this is the least amount of character or plot out of any of these.
Yes.
But it almost, by doing that, embodies The Return more than any other segment.
Yes.
When I think of The Return, I usually think of part 8. I might think of the ending. I might think of just the idea of Dougie. But up there pretty high for just thinking of things and images and sounds that represent all of The Return, Ruby crawling on the floor screaming seems really fitting for some reason. My number 3 is the glass box visitation all the way back in part 1. The actual appearance of the experiment, the evisceration of Sam and Tracy. It is such an evocative moment of horror where it's the closest Twin Peaks ever gets to I scratch your back, you scratch mine with Silent Hill. It is very effective. The way it's vibrating so aggressively, almost like a Jacob's Ladder kind of monster entity.
Yeah.
The way Sam and Tracy are used to bring in this sort of monster, I think it's just an evocative moment. It's a lot to call back on. I think it's something that it's a shadow that hangs over the rest of the series, and whether or not you individually think that you get answers or closure on it, I think depends on what you think Judy is and what the box was doing and all that.
Yeah.
But as far as a tone setter from the beginning of The Return, it sets such a different tone than Twin Peaks' first episode, the pilot, that it's just kind of this huge shift in how dark this can get, how violent this can get, how unsafe this can get. Where I decide to cheat is number 2, because originally I just put on here the sex scene from part 18, but then I'm kind of thinking it over, I'm like, well, the ending though. The ending of part 18 though. And it's I can't say that the ending of part 18 didn't resonate with me more than the previous ones I've already listed. It obviously did. But I also was I don't want to get rid of my number 5. I'm just going to put the 2 things that happened in part 18 together. So it's not only the sex scene with Diane, but I'm also going to cheat and throw in the ending. If you don't like that, you can get rid of Gordon speaking of Mr. C and do that as necessary. But for speaking individually here, the sex scene is very disturbing. And it's one of those cases where without the script telling you exactly what's going on, it's very, very apparent that something is not right in the way that Cooper is procedurally instructing Diane to do things, and Diane having to cover Cooper's face during that scene. Something about the imagery of her covering the face is very unsettling, and I think it has to do with kind of the psychological element, at least for me, maybe for others too, where because you don't see the expression, it leaves this gap in your visual knowledge where it lets you wonder. A lot of times in horror, the less you see, the more scary it actually is. I would say that a big testament to that is the success this year in 2023 with the movie Skinamarink, which last year leaked, and it's a horror movie that if you're not familiar with it, nothing happens. It is a horror movie built on the idea of unsettling analog imagery where in the darkness, your mind may play tricks on you. And even, I'm not a huge fan of the movie personally, it didn't work on me personally, but I can get why it worked on so many other people because it is your mind filling in those blank spaces and those gaps. So when Diane's covering his face, I'm not seeing Cooper's expression. That's worse than seeing it. to be honest. And up to that point, he's been so cold and unfeeling in that hotel room that it becomes this really eerie sense. It's supposed to be a lovemaking scene and a reunion of these two people who are in love with each other and who had such a great connection, but it is clearly being marred by overtones as we go back to that song from part 8, singing again in the background, My Prayer. It's not good.
Yeah,
it's not good, folks.
The delay inside the song itself as well.
Something's wrong here. It's one of the best cases of something's wrong here. I'm reminded a bit, now that I'm saying it, of like when Maddie's killed, that record player being kind of stuck. A way that Lynch uses audio to create a mood. Immediately something's not right about the scene in the way it's framed and the way it sounds. I also got to put the ending in here for obvious reasons. It is harrowing. Like, I remember when I finished The Return, feeling a deep, like, spine sense of dread. In my spine, it was dreadful. And I don't even know if I could explain all of why.
I think that's the big part that does assist in the why, if I might say. This is just me theorizing over you. Is the fact that part 17 before it is not only, like, in some senses silly in the way that it's uplifting, but it is, like, heavily, like, making things, like, fit in a way that sets Cooper off on an adventure, but also puts everything behind him.
Right.
Like, the destruction of Bob is inside of there, Cooper being fully realized, coming together with all these people, having those final goodbyes. It's something that lifts the character, that in that absence of that upliftedness, to have all of this buildup crash down in this fatal mistake, I think it's solid. I genuinely think that the ending is very solid for respects such as that.
Yes. The only aspect of The Return that I like more, that I put for number 1, is the part 13 moment of let's return to starting positions. The arm wrestling match with Mr. C and Renzo.
It's a moment of intensity that the character Mr. C becomes all the more threatening with.
It's the only Mr. C part to my memory at the moment that's comedic. At least could be comedic. For me, it is. Like, watching him just toy with Renzo and just like, I like starting positions more. It's much more comfortable. And obviously you can read into that in a sort of meta way. What is starting positions in a show all about returning, rejecting nostalgia, all those things. Mr. C never left home. He's always been there, etc., etc. Even ignoring that potential read, just the way in which Mr. C has total control from the moment he enters. He encounters this absurd situation of like, yeah, around here, we arm wrestle to determine who's boss. And Mr. C's like, is this kindergarten? Like, what are you people doing? Fine, let's get it over with. But instead of like, just, slamming it down and just getting it over with, he instead like lets this happen so his whole crew can see how completely powerless this man is in his grasp. Just the victory of this man. It's hard not to root for Mr. C. I'm not rooting for Renzo when I'm watching it. I'm rooting for Mr. C. And I just think that, like, the atmosphere of the room, even getting to see how it was made from a production standpoint, to make the double head of Renzo that spurts out the blood after the punch, seeing all the different like crew members, even that awkward like bank guy who's just kind of like chilling in the background, who got his own gather round applause specifically for him
because he's a very important character.
He's a very memorable one-off silent character.
To Mr. C, he needs to make sure he's getting that bank stuff done.
So that's my favorite scene in The Return. I think that between the two of us, we picked a lot of really good moments. I think that The Return is packed with individual scenes that are what the kids might call groovy. That's what the kids say these days.
I think the kids might say, Kalil, this is the most positive I've heard you about The Return.
Yes. Yes, it is. It really is. I could do a snide remark, but I'm not going to. I'm going to stick with positivity.
Good for you. Good for you. You know what you should also stick to?
What?
Clarity.
Clarity? I barely know her.
Who names their child Clarity?
I don't know. I feel like it's one of those names.
Like Charity is a name.
Yeah, Charity. Grace.
Grace, sure. But Clarity?
Yeah. Hope is a name.
Why didn't you just end it Claire? Claire's fine.
No, I guess you can go for Claire for short.
Bobbity. I can't wait to name my child Bobbity.
What's Bobbity?
It's my 3 kids, Bibbidi, Bobbidi, and Boo.
Oh, hey, boo-boo. Picnic baskets.
But yes.
So clarity. Some things that I want to clear up that we've mentioned on previous podcasts. One goes way back to the Mauve Zone. In the beginning of this podcast, I referred to it as the Mauve Zone off pod, and the professor did not want me to explain why I called it the Mauve Zone.
Yep, and I don't want you to explain why ever.
Well, too
Keep it
bad. This is the
inside.
day where I go against your wishes. I break free of the chains of the professor who have bound me to Prometheus. I know Prometheus is the name of the guy, but I needed to make the reference, and that's the way that it came out.
I preferred Bob over Prometheus, personally.
You can call him Prom for short. So, the Mauve Zone is an interesting situation. It is a fan name, but with a clear reason where it might come from. So, some people believe that the Purple Sea, which I guess is the more official title you can call it, the Purple Sea, and the area involving it might have been inspired by someone named Kenneth Grant, who wrote about magic and magical occurrences and connected that with alien abductions. His writings also emphasize the role of someone named Jack Parsons in the occult. Maybe that sounds familiar. Grant suggested that after the nuclear bomb and was tested and dropped, there was an occult revival, an increase in magical phenomena. So basically that he tied the alien abductions, the nuclear bomb, all the magic stuff into this sort of ideas and in his writings. This may in fact be a Mark Frost influence. I don't know. Sounds like possibly Mark Frost would know of the guy. Yeah.
Mark Frost might know the guy. Maybe it's a discussion that Lynch Frost had at one point or another.
Hard to say.
Hard to say.
Now, Grant described the Mauve Zone as a self-contained world at the very edge of reality, between existence and non-existence. It could be visited in a particular kind of sleep that manipulates human reality. There's alien monsters there, and one of the main entities in this Mauve Zone is called the Daughter. So, put all this stuff together, right? You've got this area that could be said to be existing between existence and non-existence, as the evolution of the arm obviously indicates. Mm-hmm. You've got this character saying, my mom's coming soon. That could be the Daughter. And if you take the whole sleep and consciousness thing, that ties really nicely to the dream aspects. Mm-hmm. Someone named Smoke on the Horizon on Reddit was talking about Mark Frost's books and said, quote, Dr. Jacoby makes reference to a violet presence surrounding him on his ayahuasca trip, and then theorizes that the color violet can stimulate a part of the brain, thus his glasses. So if you take that idea of sort of the violet presence, the purple area, having a correlation between the red and the blue of the glasses, that ties all that stuff together as well. Oh. So I've been calling it the Mauve Zone, although it's a fan name, I think it has really strong legs. And whether you think it was intentional or not to be a reference to this author, I feel like it's a really interesting way to view the place, and I kind of headcanon it. Enough of it lines up where I'm just like, yeah, sounds good to me, without being an expert on this writing and the origin here.
Honestly, like, the Mauve Zone not only is just a solid name for the space itself, but it also, I'm compelled by the reasoning that you have brought forward, and it is a better name than the Twilight Zone in this respect.
And the fact that it is Search for the Zone is the name of the website, you already have the zone aspect implied out there. All we're doing is putting the color to it. And I mean, it could be the purple zone, or it could literally be the mauve zone, which seems to be the way that a guy who almost certainly influenced Mark Frost describes something like this.
We have a black lodge, we have a white lodge, we have a red room, we have a mauve zone. I just need a blue space, and I think I'm pretty good now.
I was feeling pretty blue about the choice to re-voice over the Philip Jeffries Louisiana accent in the Fire Walk With Me flashback from The Return.
This is not a space in which someone can exist in. This is not a room, but go ahead, keep feeling blue anyway.
For those who may not remember, in The Return, there's a moment where it cuts back to Fire Walk With Me with Jeffries doing some of his speech, and instead of having it be David Bowie's original audio, they have it be the new performer who is playing the role of Jeffries. At the time in our podcast when we got to it, I was really not a fan of that. I was feeling at least mixed, if not outright negative, because I wanted to hear the Philip Jeffries voice. I figured, well, if you're reusing the footage, instead of voicing over this character, use the original. It felt almost a little potentially disrespectful to voice over. I have an egg on my face now. Because if
You're the disrespectful one.
If this is true, this is from a Screen Rant article. David Lynch, the director, is quoted as saying, "We got permission to use the old footage, but he didn't want his voice used in it. I think someone must have made him feel bad about his Louisiana accent in Fire Walk with Me. But I think it's so beautiful. He wanted to have it done by a legitimate actor from Louisiana. So that's what we had to do. The guy did a great job." The guy being voice actor Nathan Frizzell. So, according to David Lynch, this choice to have the audio redubbed was a choice by David Bowie. And when David Bowie passed and Jeffries became the full-fledged character, the flashback 2 was dubbed over.
Which honestly, like, on David Bowie's parts, however you may feel about the scene itself, and however, like, it may be stated or emphasized, it's a very respectable path. It's something where, like, he's wanting that someone to properly represent this dialogue that he felt that he couldn't properly represent is then emphasized and represented. So honestly, I put points inside of Bowie's ballpark for that. Not to mention, it's something that gave someone a big means of work that probably further helped his career as well, just because Twin Peaks isn't exactly a small sort of like town show, if you will.
A big aspect of Philip Jeffries is the "we live inside a dream" idea, which gets further expanded by the Monica Bellucci dream and David Lynch / Gordon Cole asking who is the dreamer. The names that I see most often attributed to the dreamer that people believe could be the dreamer, if there is a literal dreamer, are Dale Cooper, Laura Palmer, Gordon Cole, David Lynch, not Gordon Cole, like the actual guy who made it, the audience, the viewer creating the dream with the show, or maybe Audrey.
Maybe you heard someone else.
I hear you're making
someone else potentially could be the dreamer.
You're making some great reenactments of the grunt sounds of the Kremlings from the Donkey Kong Country franchise.
Please, this is Sarah Palmer, perhaps.
So, Sarah Palmer, a less popular choice, but well explained and well defended by the professor here. So, it got me thinking, and this is where I want to clarify maybe a position, clarify an idea, not so much a correction, but just to understand where we're coming from. When we ask who is the dreamer, we talk about who is the dreamer, what that means exactly. Because it kind of got my brain worrying, W-H-I-R-R-I-N-G, not worrying, just to clarify. I am quite content.
It's beans.
It was more just going percolating, one could say. It got me thinking about how it goes past even saying they're the main character or main protagonist. Because when you're talking about someone being the dreamer, if we take it literally, that this world either revolves around them or is born from them, at the very least, no matter how you want to dice that, they're at the center of this world. And it reveals things about that character potentially or the world around them. This, again, depends on how much you want to go for it. You could take a very extreme position one direction, that all of the characters in this dream of the original series, The Return, whatever you want to extend it to, all of these characters are aspects of this dreamer, are figments of this dreamer, that you could Freudian analyze the fact that all of these characters mean something in the dream to this person. They're all metaphors, if you will. Or people they've met in real life distorted by a dream, potentially. You can go swing the opposite direction and say that the dream is like the Matrix, and it's more just like people still have autonomy and identities and everything in there, but it is an illusory world in a sense. But instead of everyone being in their own pods, that there is a sort of central figure that's creating this dream. It doesn't make the characters false in any way. You could take any striation in between those areas, but it already changes the way fundamentally you interact with Twin Peaks.
I like to get the Matrix and add tentacles and then make a Cthulhu, because the stories around Cthulhu tend to be like other people living their own lives inside of this wild realm that's beyond their imagination, but inside of a waking dream of a greater being. Technically, everything is around Cthulhu, but at the same time, I still went off to college and I did my thing, but Cthulhu's still there.
So are we the dreams of Cthulhu? I'm not as familiar with Lovecraftian ideas.
It's something where it's not, you can't really Freudian, like, out someone specifically inside the dream. It's just that there are people that are going to likely fill the slots around this being, around this entity, just like things that are formed in respects to make up that space, if I'm not mistaken. It's kind of like that sense from what I'm familiar with dreams, and yes, one can Freudian out various things likely from dreams. I'm less convinced in the respects that I don't know how the people that I end up bumping into my dreams are specific when I can hardly even remember their faces as well. When it's these sort of like scenarios I'm sort of like dropped into on how these independent lives that I'm coming in contact with, how they are reminiscent entirely of me, when some of them I don't feel as connected with. I find various aspects of my own dreams to be fairly alien with me.
Mm-hmm.
I also sort of take this sort of like feel this vibe and also this greater world aspect into The Return. I do believe in the idea of the dreamer, but more in a larger respect of what does that mean for the world around them, more than it is what are these characters in the world. So yeah, I take it as what does this place mean more than what is Dale Cooper
so
in this
if Sarah
context.
Palmer is the dreamer,
Yes,
what does this place mean?
What does this place mean? In this respect, the place means a sort of like feeding embedded ground created by entities much larger than themselves, trying to create as much of their sustenance and force that is beyond Sarah Palmer, in this case, this little frog moth situation, so that they can continue this sort of like sustenance feed. Sarah Palmer, in the grand scheme of things, means nothing, and these lives mean nothing as long as they can extract what is necessary from them, almost like these symbiotic scavengers.
If you like anime, one potential connection I could at this point imply, with heavy spoilers if I were to say it, were to be to Madoka Magica. There is something in Madoka Magica that I could connect to. If you know Madoka Magica, insert connection here. Note please that my connection is very witty, very smart, and impresses you. But yeah, this whole idea of the dreamer I think is interesting, because even just hearing your thoughts on it, my brain obviously goes in slightly different directions, and we, even between the two of us, have such different takes on what it would even mean for a character to be the dreamer. And I could even take it as far, if I wanted to go really grandiose with it, basically saying who's God. Because in this idea of the world revolving around them, or their being at the center of this world, if you take it really far, what's the difference between this sort of unknowable, universal dreamer and the idea of a god that is in everyone in some way, or is able to preside over everything? Because not every conception of a god has the idea of destiny or fate. Some do, some don't. The idea of someone kind of seeing this all go in front of them, it's all kind of a play being done on their behalf. These are the characters molded in their image, but they're not necessarily always playing on the field. They might even have an avatar, like, again, your Jesus scenario of Sarah Palmer, if you will.
What is Jeff to a god?
And I know this sounds silly, but I mean, I think this is a genuine take you could have. Because let's say you take Laura Palmer as the dreamer, okay? Could you not then look at it where Laura Palmer is the dreamer in the flesh? That is your avatar figure, and everything that's kind of being transpired around it is the story, is the gospel, if you will, of this character. I think you could go off the rail with this.
I think that there's a lot of fun experimentation when it comes to this larger narrative, that you can have so much fun with the idea of a dreamer.
And you can't be proven wrong, I don't think.
I don't think that there's many places that people can be proven wrong, except in like small instances, but I also think that that's just part of the legwork The Return gives, in both like its double-edged swordness.
And this is where I think there's room for fun, as long as someone doesn't believe that, oh, I figured it out, Laura Palmer is Jesus, let me explain why. I think it's more like you have to go with a sense of kind of playfulness and fun, knowing that this is a way you could take it. And if you can find evidence and fit it together, you can make yourself a really interesting interpretation of all of Twin Peaks that way. But I think that's ultimately what this question means to me. When I ask who is the dreamer, if I take it literally, I have to keep adding that qualifier because I'm not sure I do. But if I do, I think it kind of becomes, who is this all for? It kind of becomes, who's the main, again, even beyond main character like a protagonist, but what is this story about? Is it the story about the little girl from the lane? Or is it something else? So if I think, a character like James, right? I think of James as the dreamer. That's a really far out idea, I think. But then it becomes a really interesting narrative of this guy who kind of lives in his own world where he's putting on this persona of this, like, James Dean biker guy, but is honestly a very soft-hearted guy, very much a contradiction in that sense. He's the cool, tough motorcycle kid who's not cool and not tough, and do not let Shelley Johnson tell you otherwise. And I look at him in The Return, and I'm like, if he's the dreamer, what happened to the dream? What happened that derailed the dream? We're told there was an accident. The book by Mark Frost, Final Dossier, extends that idea, but it becomes this very different story about how people try to run away from their problems, and it just keeps coming back to them.
Yes.
And I think that makes Freddy have a totally different meaning if James is the dreamer. So I think even then I could go on, and I could try to explore how everything fits James being the dreamer. And I don't even believe in that. But it becomes a really fun mental exercise that I don't know of many shows that can have something like that. The closest thing I can think of to a show having a dreamer is in, without spoiling it, one of the Marvel shows that came out in the last few years on the Disney Plus service. I won't say any more about that, but if you're kind of familiar with what I'm talking about, there's something like that there, but even then it's not quite the same, in my opinion, as what Twin Peaks might be implying.
But what if the Twin Peaks implies Tim Pinkle is the dreamer? TP? Twin Peaks?
The world has been taxidermied. What does that mean?
It's lifeless. Husk sits there to be a display for everyone, which honestly some people could make a reading.
Yeah, you could do that, and I think it becomes interesting. It becomes like a framework or a theoretical lens to view the whole show through a character's story. It's a fun exercise. The other thing I kind of wanted to clarify is a question that I have been hinting at and teasing at and foreshadowing for a few episodes now, and that is the question that if The Return says Laura is the one, what does it mean Laura is the one?
She's a Highlander.
She is the Highlander.
She is a Highlander.
There can be only one, Professor.
There can only be one, but she has to make her journey despite being dead.
I struggle with this one a bit more because I feel like what Laura is changes drastically depending on what Twin Peaks material you're looking at. I think that she is a golden egg. She is literally the golden orb that was handed down that is making Senorita Dido Dido smile a big ol' smile grin.
She's one of the large conflicts inside of the world, especially whenever it comes to Sarah Palmer as well as Leland Palmer. I think that without the existence of Laura Palmer, where would Leland be? Where would Sarah be? I don't think that Bob is thinking to himself, like, oh, yes, I need a girl to do the... I imagine, though Bob is insane, he seems more creative than the absolute need for a child in this case. I think that the pain Leland shows off and what could be offered from these conflicts with Laura Palmer inside of his life, and how much that actually breaks him after the instance on what could be finally, what would say, a breakthrough away from Bob, this little moment of respite for what happened with Bob. It's all centered around Laura. Laura becomes one of the most important characters inside of some of the most pained people's lives. What we see is a great family in instances such as Where Is My Axe? There are solid moments that show that the Palmer household could be good, but it's also very, 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 very much met into conflict with all these sorts of forces, both within and outside of the control of the people inside the household. I think contextually, Laura Palmer became the one as Twin Peaks will continue to expand and we got to learn more of these characters. Laura is the one because she is conflicted with these horrifying things outside of her control, but there were still more chances and opportunities until she sort of fell into the resting grounds she now, occupies, or she did occupy, depending on
Can't bury her deep enough.
Can't bury her deep enough.
I feel like the most boring answer, at least one of the most boring answers I could offer, is
Highlander.
that very literally, Laura is the one that starts the whole show. Like, you wouldn't have Twin Peaks on it, not even like a metaphor. No, I mean, like, very literally, you need to have Laura Palmer die for the murder mystery. Like, it is the whole entire basic premise of the pilot. This is the thing. This is the one that starts everything. And in that way, like, it is the nucleus, right? It is this centerpiece right here. And I think you could look at it that way, very, very literally. You could also look at it if we ask who is the dreamer, maybe the answer, Laura is the one. That's the answer. It's right in front of us the whole time. It could be that simple if you want it to be. And for all the ways in which she can be a glowing orb of hope, and she can have the angel and all that sort of greatness and goodness and inspire people, she's also this walking contradiction that she is the daughter of two demons. In the Frost book, it says the marriage of those two demons could end the entire world. She's the daughter of those two. We saw that scene. We saw that scene on the stairs with her grinning. We saw the way that with Harold, that her face flashed into what it could have been with a Bob form.
Yes.
All these things indicate that Laura could have been the next entity for Bob to possess. I want to taste through your mouth, and it would have been possibly even more dangerous and more deadly than anything else. And maybe that's actually, maybe coming to think of it, if we take the Frost book, maybe it's that the marriage between Bob and, well, Beelzebub and Jowdy, those two together, it's not really that their union together in a marriage would destroy the world. It's that their offspring would, not right away, but like if Bob had gotten into Laura, if Bob could have transferred over to Laura rather than Laura dying, maybe that's what would have ended the world. That's a very, I was going to say pliable. It seems like the wrong word, but it also is the right word. It's a very pliable theory. You could run with that. At the end of the day, whether she's a martyr, a savior, a manipulator, whatever she is, I find the most compelling answer to, what does it mean if Laura is the one, is to look at the human being of Laura Palmer that I find in The Secret Diary and in Fire Walk with Me a little bit less often. I find the real story, or the realistic story, of a teenage girl trying to make sense of her life and world while dealing with what's going on in her family, something that she can't talk to anyone about, not even Donna. And that the only escape she has are things that make her feel good, but she judges herself for, and are in a lot of ways really hurting her.
Yes.
That the adults that are making her feel good in her life are using her, are taking advantage of her.
Yes.
And even the people who are kind of on her side, Donna doesn't get it. Bobby, she doesn't really want to tell everything to. James is sweet, but he's so dumb. You end up with this character who's utterly alone. And this really effective portrayal, I think, of topics that people didn't want to bring up and still do not bring up. So beyond any supernatural explanation, I am most interested in Laura Palmer as a human being. Period, full stop, end the message, smiley face with the all. Which brings me to my biggest takeaway from Twin Peaks at the moment. This could change as I continue to dive in, experiment with new ideas, think about new dreamers, if you will. But if I had to sum up the point of Twin Peaks for me in a single idea, it would be how we do not see the suffering around us. We don't know it, and we aren't equipped for it. I don't think Twin Peaks provides all the answers of what should we do. Like, I think it's obvious that we need systems in place to help people like Laura Palmer, to help at-risk youth who have the risk of falling into drugs, who have the risk at being used and sexually abused either by their family or by other adults, who don't have anyone to trust or really talk to who would understand what they're going through. I think we need systems in place for that. But could any individual person have saved Laura Palmer in Twin Peaks? Could a better Jacoby have saved her? Could a better Margaret Lanterman have saved her? If Cooper had gotten there, just a week earlier in town and really had a good conversation with her, could anyone have saved her? I think that's almost at a certain point beside the point, at least what I get out of Twin Peaks. The biggest thing is becoming aware of the fact that there is suffering around us and trying to find methods, both personal and societal, to help these people.
No, I think that, if anything, the individual part of trying to save someone and putting it on yourself in such a heavy fashion is something that maybe there was no other options, and maybe you just go down the path. But Cooper failed inside of his mission, despite his good intentions. I think that it takes more than just good intentions, though, to handle it.
And that's a very supernatural way of handling it, too.
It's a very supernatural way.
You have to do time-traveling, dimension-hopping, identity swapping. There's a dead man in your chair. Why is he there? We got to go to Twin Peaks right now. We're leaving Texas.
Let's take the return out of the equation for just even a moment, though. Even when it came to everything that happened with the Red Room, everything that was happening with Wyndham Earl, there was still an attempt nonetheless from Dale Cooper, who went into the Red Room alone without friendship by his side. And as he passed through the door, he did not come out the same.
No. And if you remove all the spirituality and supernatural elements, I think you can still read the ending of season 2 as a man who goes out in the woods at night to try to face his former mentor and try to save Annie, but ends up leaving the woods a very changed man. Wyndham Earl never seen again, and something happened with Annie, and we'll never know the full truth of what happened in those dark woods that day. All Truman saw was his friend come back and something wasn't right. You can believe that without any sort of spirits, any sort of anything. If we live inside a dream, we live inside the nightmares too. But going back to even Laura Palmer here, there's these people quietly suffering around us. I think Bobby was 100% right at the funeral to call out everyone, including himself, for not really doing more about it to try to help Laura, that these systems are failing. And if I want to bring the return back into it, I look at someone like Dougie Jones. Whether that's the intent or not, I'm reading it as that Dougie Jones was someone who obviously needed help. This was someone who, while he was always a little bit maybe different or odd in some way, people noticed a huge change in his personality, that he was not acting right. Friends, colleagues, etc., but no one really did anything. Friends who maybe were a little concerned kind of talked to their spouse and were sharing some words but didn't do anything about it. Law enforcement who saw him thought it was a little odd but also really didn't do anything about it. Everyone else, for the most part, as long as Dougie made them money, they didn't really do anything about it either. And that's a very cynical way to read it, but I think it's a valid reading, that his wife really didn't seem too alarmed by the fact that her husband had completely gone through what might be a mental breakdown and some severe psychosis of some kind, because her husband got rid of the debt. He's got a hot bod. The kid seems fine. We're just going to continue like it's normal. We're just going to continue like it's normal is a pretty big theme of this conversation here. And he made money for his boss, Bushnell Mullins, who definitely noticed something was wrong, but again, he's making money, it's fine. He was making money for the Mitchum brothers. As long as he showed up with the right item from that dream, we're not going to worry too much about that. Not that I expected the Mitchum brothers to be the ones to get him help, but you get the idea. Call for help is a pretty big deal, and it feels like the people who benefit from Dougie are pretty quick to not help him. And nobody's helping him. And I even wonder if Dougie got transported to the town of Twin Peaks, and provided no one recognized it was Dale Cooper, just it was some guy like Dougie, would the people of Twin Peaks have helped someone like Dougie? And I'm not inclined to say yes. I'm inclined to say that the town of Twin Peaks, despite all the talks of goodness that people might wax poetic about, like Dale Cooper back in season 1 and 2, like Harry Truman might say, despite all this supposed goodness, they don't seem to always be able to help people who are right in front of them really needing help.
Or even people are able to help themselves that much. It's something in which there is a deep darkness that seems to be enveloping over Twin Peaks.
And I could wax poetic forever about Nadine's mental health concerns, that when she was going through clear signs of needing help, when she was putting on these personas, Jacoby basically said, just kind of let her do it, and then we're just going to pick up the pieces later. And that was the best idea they really had. And obviously, things going on then with Johnny Horn. Was he actually being helped? And Josie. I think Josie is really important in this conversation, because Josie doesn't get the clean slate that a lot of characters do. She's a messy person. She's a messy character. She's complicated. She hurt people. She manipulated people. She lied to people. She used people. She was also a victim. And she was a victim of systems that, again, were not able to really be worked against, were not able to be helped. And I think in order to survive, she developed these traits in order to get through and live. And in that way, I think there's echoes of Laura Palmer in Josie. It's like those who care often can't help, and those who can help don't care. Seems to be a general trend. Wherever you put Jacoby in that, you could put him somewhere in there. And there's all these generational cycles. And the kind of thesis that I've been developing for these past few episodes is that what breaks these cycles usually is love. And it's a very obvious answer, but I feel like it's in tone with Twin Peaks. That it's community and love, oftentimes from family, like with Bobby's father to Bobby, Bobby to Becky. Or it's friends, Cooper to Truman. I think the answer and solution is to face these things, to face these darknesses, these problems, and to try to find solutions together as a community and come together around these things. Not to isolate and not to hide them, which then goes back to my continuous raging against the Dr. Hayward.
Nothing happened with Dr. Hayward, though.
Good doctor.
The good doctor. He does good things. He patched up Ben Horn just good. Very goodly.
And I don't believe that it's the intention of the creators necessarily, but I think Dr. Hayward becomes this great symbol of everything wrong with Twin Peaks because he's always covering up the truth. He's always wanting to delay the truth, whether it's an autopsy, the cover-up of the report on the medical office for the final dossier, or as we see at the end of season 2, trying to cover up the family stuff going on with Donna. He's continuously trying to hide from the uncomfortable truths. And he was literally the Palmer family's closest connection, and all of this was happening around them, and they couldn't really do or see anything. And I think that, not to blame the Haywards entirely for, the evil of Leland or Bob, but I think there's this element in which the people who quietly do nothing and say nothing and try to hide the darkness, do not talk about it, do not air that dirty laundry, that's how these systems perpetuate. And the moment that things got too much, Dr. Hayward's response was to abandon and leave. And not to smudge over any nuance, but at least according to the final dossier, I don't get any proof or indication he tried to help his family after it. I think he just abandoned ship.
I think that he may have felt that it was best for him to do so, and I do think that there are methods that come from Dr. Hayward that can find themselves in great ethical discussions whenever it comes to both truth and lies. I will just say that after you smash a man's head against a fireplace and everything else after that comes out rather concerningly, it's something that most certainly does hurt an area of credibility. It's an exploration that I think has been done better in other forms of media. I think I mentioned the memory of the Slug Queen in RuneScape before on how do you break the news of someone who's memory isn't all there, but also you don't want them howling in pain and dying in the respects of them realizing their horrifying situation. I do think that there is a cushion lies can give, but not to the excess that Dr. Hayward had given.
To give Mark Frost's book more credit, with The Secret History of Twin Peaks, it is established that there's a big difference between mysteries and secrets. And secrets are evil. Secrets are villainous. There's a sense in which secrets are a sign of danger and badness. And I think that Twin Peaks being a town full of secrets, rather than a town full of honesty and truth, if I had to pinpoint what the problem is, I would pinpoint that more than any demon. I would pinpoint that more than any supernatural evil as the real problem. And I also I guess I prefer that to be what I take away from it. Because if I view Twin Peaks as just a show about evil demons and supernatural aliens and stuff, I don't really have much to draw from it. I mean, it could be fun and entertaining to have that. But I think there's a powerful message of Twin Peaks you can read into if we take Twin Peaks to be a warning against apathy. To take Twin Peaks as a sign that people can be able to help each other, that you don't have to be like Dr. Hayward, you can be like Bobby.
You don't have to be like Dr. Hayward.
You can be like Bobby.
What a fantastic little fun takeaway. You can be like Bobby. Listener, you too can be like Bobby.
I feel like you're going to go try to sell them something. You too, Bob. It can be just like...
I won't lie. I do have the Showtime store open on one of the pages just because a little bit of curiosity took me far away from home. But no, listeners,
He's
you
getting
can
bored
buy
of
yourself...
listening to me talk about Twin Peaks. And he's like, it's the last episode. He just keeps going on and on and on and on.
No!
Time to do some shopping.
My brain worms do not move unless they tell themselves to move.
Worm hype.
Chugga chugga... Woo-hoo. So,
no,
don't you dare...
I think you mean chugga, whoosh whoosh.
You're not even going into a whoosh, you just wanted to press the button.
I don't know.
And I'm going to press a button right now on my big lesson. Take it. No, I'm pressing my own buttons. You put your hand off the soundboard. This is my time. I don't need a button. Twin Peaks, as far as a piece of media, what I'm about to say is something that's gonna first contradict the traditional idea of the metaphor, but I will say that it is the biggest truth for me. And that is Twin Peaks is a giant train crash that I love. It's something where with this piece of media, I see all sorts of forms of styles, experimentation, and voice that I don't know from other pieces of media. There's so many pieces of media out there that, for good reason, seek out an area of synergy just so that this has the feel of this, so this connects to this whenever dealing with multiple series, whenever dealing with products that are outside of the usual realm that, say, for example, books and other pieces of media. However, I can say right now, for the vast majority of pieces, Twin Peaks feels like Twin Peaks, and yet it is in the form of Laura Palmer's diary, which is a tale of horror, dread, and a bit of personal feelings that I don't know how to properly word out. It is just something that is very, very much Laura Palmer's secret note. And even when we get to see Laura Palmer on screen, that feels different from both Twin Peaks as well as The Secret Diary. When you're able to explore, see through the eyes, and also see through the emotional downfalls that come through Laura trying to live her life with everything that happens in her final days. When I look at The Return, when it comes back into it, there's all sorts of ways and leans one could have done for a potential season 3, and many people might even say that there might have been more smart ways for, say, for example, synergy areas, but The Return still remains as something heavily David Lynch. It is heavily what David Lynch wanted, and it moves around. It is shot in a fashion that, again, I don't see that much. Much of the most memorable points of all the shows have a different energy to them that I think is heavily impressive. And even when I get somewhat of the same tone, it's still not necessarily the same. It's still something weird and different. The card art, where you're getting weird little pieces and facts on, that was just fun for a good time and a laugh. When I got to see the Welcome to Twin Peaks book, in which we're actually introduced to the city, and we're trying to compare stacks of pancakes with Big Ed, and it's having a lot of like joyous fun with something that, let's just face it, has so many things that in its foundation are much darker than any page inside the Welcome to Twin Peaks books will provide. When I look into pieces of material such as the Secret History of Twin Peaks as well as the Final Dossier, I don't necessarily agree with the structure of the Final Dossier, but can I also say that that significantly feels different and tries to explore things in new fashions even to its comparative counterpart of the Secret History? Yeah, absolutely. Everywhere I look, there's a wholly new experience, and I respect the hell out of it, though I don't put everything on the same sort of like equal weight, whether it is for strength or favoritism. Twin Peaks is fantastic for that.
Beautiful train wreck.
It's a beautiful train wreck.
Can't look away.
I have yet to. I went through 77 episodes of not looking away.
And I'm telling you to look out! Because there's some wonderful and strange questions of the week.
The train is already wrecked. I don't know what to look at.
A new train.
It's another train.
Yes, a new train. If I had a train noise, you know I'd push that button right now. And you know I want to. But I'm resisting.
You're resisting because you don't have it.
I'm trying to be like Bobby.
What?
And not like Dr. Hayward.
What a strange moral compass you have built. What a strange
and just like
compass.
You pointed out that Twin Peaks is full of complexities and contradictions, you know, it would be in character for me to push a button, but because it's in character, I'm not going to do it because I don't want to be consistent. I want to be inconsistent.
You can be as inconsistent as you want. Can we get someone else in here?
So we have someone else in here. We have several someone else's. I spun over the microphone to you, the listeners, and got a few listener questions and hot takes we're going to run by here. The first one comes from Craig from the Twin Peaks Evangelion podcast.
Hi, Craig.
Which, if you haven't checked them out yet, they are a podcast that talks about Twin Peaks, as well as the anime series Neon Genesis Evangelion.
And if you haven't checked out, Kalil actually joined them for a small venture in the past.
For the holiday special commentary, talk through, walk through, speak through of the movie End of Evangelion. Anyway, Craig sent us the following audio, which I'm going to now roll.
Kia ora, Kalil and the Unplugged Professor. This is Craig here from the Twin Peaks Evangelion podcast. I have a question for you. First off, I know this has come up on your podcast, but I would love for you to expand a little bit on your thoughts and ideas and, I guess, perceptions of the infamous 4.5-hour YouTube video, Twin Peaks Actually Explained, parentheses, no really, close parentheses. In particular, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the meta-narrative theory that's sort of at play there. How do you feel about the idea that Twin Peaks characters, in particular in The Return, I guess, but even in the original series and the film, what's your thoughts on the ideas that these characters are either aware that they're fictional characters in a TV narrative, or that they are slowly becoming attuned to that fact? Loved your podcast. Very sad to see you close the door on it, but keen to see what you guys come up with in the future, and all the best, and I'll see you in the trees.
So I had the professor watch the 4.5-hour, roughly, video by Twin Perfect, and I also did my second viewing of said video to kind of address the video overall, as well as the meta readings of Twin Peaks.
I'll also mention, just for personal time's sake, because there's a lot going on at the moment, that we did see the main video. I did notice in my recommended feed that there's apparently even more.
Yes.
Like, there's a follow-up video.
I did not rewatch that. I watched it when it first came out. I'm of the opinion that we can really talk about it without needing that extra information.
Very well.
It's about pretty similar quality and type of content from what I remember as the original main video. So I watched this for the first time like 3 years ago when it came out, pretty much before our podcast started. So I think it's really interesting to actually go back to it now and talk about it, because it really bookends this podcast for me. From what I understand, this video is kind of infamous within the Twin Peaks community, that a lot of times people don't necessarily, do like takedowns of it, but they'll oftentimes kind of just jokingly allude to a certain 4-hour analysis video, which I've always just assumed is, this one, the big one. It's definitely one of the most, in terms of view count and popularity, one of the most popular dissections of Twin Peaks on the internet. It's very influential and very big, and Twin Perfect had a huge amount of success in following their Silent Hill analysis series, which, of course, Silent Hill and Twin Peaks are like bread and brie on a sandwich.
And I will say openly, when it comes down to this discussion, it seems to be heavily researched. It is something in which I do see a lot of deep diving into it, and also some very impressive framing when it comes down to trying to work in what I would refer to as David Lynch's Twin Peaks. A lot of it heavily does rely towards David Lynch's intake, despite that there is still more to Twin Peaks than just David Lynch. But it's fair to say that people may try to reach out to a reading from David Lynch, especially since David Lynch took such a strong hold onto it during The Return.
And I want to add on to it that, great production value. That this is a very well-made video. And I think that whether you end up agreeing with the overall main point of the video or some of the primary theses that Twin Perfect is working with, I think that there's a lot of really good observations that, if not intentional on David Lynch's part, are still remarkable coincidences.
Like, for example, I think that one observation that we were talking about, like the Jade Ring and so on, but also putting out, I never noticed the hole in the Formica table. That little, small slot, and having that being emphasized inside the film. It does make sense for, say, for example, something being wrought out of this, and then being presented with this green ring. It makes sense inside the context of the film. This is much more than a special stone.
This is clearly coming from a lot of observing, painstaking amounts of going through the footage to find every little detail. So, things I like. I like the distinguishing that happens in the video between 3 different styles of interpreting Twin Peaks. That some people interpret Twin Peaks as it's weird and kind of just end the conversation there. Some people interpret Twin Peaks with in-universe explanations, and this is, probably the most popular. It's any explanation that explains Twin Peaks using lore, character info, things in universe. And then there's the third, more meta interpretation, which is what this video generally follows. I liked the emphasis on the idea that at the end of Fire Walk with Me, the light on Laura's face is from a TV set, that that it just looks like that, so it is. Like, I mean it like it sounds. And so there's this light on the effect of Laura's face, and she's laughing and crying because she's realizing that she is on a TV show, and that's her reaction to that. I think that's a really interesting way to interpret that ending, because do I think that the emotion she's expressing could be that? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like, that's the weird joke of her life that she is now processing.
And mind you, I think that my sort of like scope onto that, what I kind of can see a viewing of Dale Cooper's final moments in part 17, when there's sort of like that little reflection of him as he's gazing out. You could almost say that, like, that's the reflection on a glass, yes. Either a looking glass that you're looking through, or the reflection of, say, for example, a screen. There's
a lot you can do with that.
There's a lot you can do with it. There's a good running place for it.
He does a good case for the meta reading, and he also is really good with the special features. Like, we were going through a lot of them, and he pulls up footage from those, even to the point of pointing out how Lynch pronounces Nido as NATO, and using that to possibly explain the Jiao Dai being, Judy of some kind, that it's a changing pronunciation, because the original idea here of Jiao Dai, linguistically, having its origins in meaning closure or explanation, that the great evil of the return is closure, is having answers, is having explanations. And if you want to take a meta reading, then you have this idea that Mr. C is the person desperately seeking after closures and answers. He's the villain. Say what you will about that. I think some of the logic throughout this video is very solid. I think some of it's a bit weaker, in my opinion. And so, I kind of refrain from talking too much about this video at length, because I never want to try to take down someone else's video. I think that anyone who puts this amount of work into making Twin Peaks content deserves a lot of respect. Not just Twin Peaks content, any kind of content, because this is obviously a labor of love. But I do think, since we're being asked to respond to the video's logic, there are parts where I think it's a bit stretchy. Like, for example, he quotes characters talking about how they feel like they're living in a dream, and almost montages them. But the elephant in the room for me is that other people were writing a lot of those lines, not David Lynch. That it's not just a David Lynch reel to prove intentions here. One point looks at sawing logs as meaning that they're in a dream. And I'm like, okay, I get it, but also it literally is a logging town. I don't think that has to mean that. One of the most, I think, wild claims is that the spinning locker man in the pilot, that kid is waving in to bring the police in with energy. Like, it's things like this where a lot of the video seems to have these sort of interesting premises that are sometimes backed up really well. And then other times it's like, I'm following you, but I'm also thinking this is just a guy doing a funny wave as he's like spinning away. They're just in a logging town. That's why we're sawing logs. Everything about the way that he talks about Nadine seemed to be at odds with what I'm thinking. Sycamore trees being used because TV sets, their bark looks like static TV. I'm just kind of looking at this. It's like, very specifically, you have to read these things to get this interpretation. You have to go through and really try to cherry pick to find these things and spin them in a way where it feels kind of against the obvious answers. Like, you have to really try to make this fit. One of the ones that really bothered me then was applying this logic to Diane in The Return, and he basically claims that Diane is like the show, and the audience who wants answers to the mysteries are like Mr. C. And at first it was like, oh, he can't be possibly. But then he clarified, no, he is basically comparing how audiences want the answers to Twin Peaks to Diane being sexually assaulted. Like, we're assaulting the show, and I think that that's a terrible thing if the show was doing that on purpose. But two, I don't believe that's what's intended at all. I understand the idea, but to me, to take away all of the stuff with Diane and be like, yes, it's a metaphor for how the audience wants answers and closure, I don't like that. That doesn't sit well with me. Another moment is talking about the fish in the percolator being like an idea in your noggin. And that Jeffries isn't in a tea kettle, he's in a coffee maker, a percolator, if you will. And a lot of this hinges on the idea that David Lynch is the primary author of Twin Peaks. Like you said so well at the beginning, this is explaining David Lynch's Twin Peaks. when the fish in the percolator thing, from the sources I've at least read, it indicates that it was a reference to a story in a different writer working on the show. Like a different writer is working on the show. He had an experience kind of like the fish in the percolator and wrote it in as a little joke. That to take that and be like, oh, yes, it connects to this grand theory, I think that's a pretty faulty premise.
I think that when you are dealing with something as large as Twin Peaks, I think that the most illuminating thing, and it's not to say that it's like discounts or like doesn't create like these unified ideas with Twin Peaks. I think Twin Peaks is very much a messy thing, especially with how many of the creators had difficulties communicating with another. He does state that there were issues with season 2 and how like David Lynch did come in to try to sweep things up. In the respects of it, but there still was notably a fair amount of miscommunication. There was a fair amount of disagreement, and there was a fair amount of what I would imagine to be compromises as we came up to these conclusions on these various people. I only cautiously state something such as David Lynch's Twin Peaks when comparing this work, mostly because of the various amounts of momentous minds that have to go into this work, and the way that they are most certainly going to complicate the mesh. It's something where I do believe in, at the very least, a fair amount of the sentiment and also the mindset that the person who created the video put themselves into, and it does compare well with how David Lynch wants to try to communicate through mediums such as art forms. But I also think that even if David Lynch communicates far better through such things as art forms, it's still going to be heavily weighed down by various amounts of bias that it's hard for me to look past that as well. Everyone looks at a painting in a different fashion, I find.
And pardon me if I'm repeating maybe some of the ideas you're already hinting at, and I think that this is a really big concern. For those who haven't seen the video, I think that what Twin Perfect is doing is actually pretty similar to what a lot of people do when they talk about Twin Peaks, is they attribute authorship to David Lynch. And I understand that in maybe a David Lynch film like Inland Empire, that makes a lot of sense. He's the writer and the director of the whole thing. But there isn't a single part of Twin Peaks where David Lynch worked alone. That from the very beginning, Mark Frost was a co-writer, that seasons 1 and 2 had many different writers and directors aside from David Lynch, that Fire Walk With Me had a co-writer with Robert Engels, so even Fire Walk With Me isn't all David Lynch, that The Return had Mark Frost listed as a co-writer. So any attempt to say that this is Lynch's intent is really tough to prove, because not a single part of Twin Peaks is just David Lynch's writing. That's before you even throw in like how actors would ad-lib things or throw in references, and depending on which Twin Peaks you book, you read like Brad Duke's Reflections or The Essential Wrapped in Plastic. You learn all these stories about how things came to be. A lot of it was chaos. Kind of like what Professor was saying earlier about the train wreck scenario. So I think that the idea of looking at all of this through the lens of David Lynch's singular vision doesn't quite work. And I want to emphasize that it wouldn't matter if you were ignoring intent. If you just want to come at this and say that there is a singular message throughout it, this is a way to read it, I think it'd be fine. But if you are arguing you can prove what David Lynch intended, and that is what Twin Perfect is saying, that's when I think this becomes a problem. Because you have no way to prove everything David Lynch intended. And going throughout the entire series to find moments that could be that way has some problems with it.
I think it has some problems. I will state, at least for my own case, if it's something that this person is trying to prove whether or not like this is David Lynch's intent, it's a very reasonable argument, and it is a very convincing one. I think it is probably one of the most convincing ones you'll find out there for David Lynch's intent, and that goes into the value of how much research has gone into it. I just think that this is far more complicated thanks to all the sorts of running pieces that come into something as massive as Twin Peaks.
I think what kind of makes it difficult, too, for me to respond to is that if this is the intent, like let's say he correctly identified what David Lynch meant the whole video through, I disagree with David Lynch. Like, this is where I would look at it and I'd be like, okay, so? Like, this is my overall feelings on it, because not to, I don't want to reduce the entire video to like one sentence because he goes through a lot, but in this meta reading, it largely reads to me as David Lynch writing Twin Peaks to try to be against how television has readily made disposable violence. And instead of having a killer, like a murderer of the week and trying to have like a victim who's just there to service the plot, making the victim the whole plot, and then the Fire Walk With Me and The Return end up being kind of responses to how the network shut down the show and how all of this spirals again around the idea of consumable TV violence being the whole point. I look at all of this and I'm like, so? Because I think it's fine to have a meta reading of Twin Peaks. I think that it's hard not to have some meta elements because in the original show, Audrey literally hears the theme music. Like, she's dancing to the soundtrack. There's literally soap opera in the soap opera.
We've literally been on so many elements of seeing things in different lenses and how Twin Peaks can't be viewed by just one.
Yes. And I think that in the end, if all Twin Peaks is talking about consumable TV violence, I think it's limiting. I think it limits what's actually interesting about it to me, which are the characters, the music, the imagery. And I think it's also just kind of a very silly message, in my opinion, because I don't think there's anything wrong with enjoying a piece of media that isn't like Twin Peaks, that does have what they call disposable or consumable human violence. I think that, yeah, there is some media you could argue does it better than others, but I don't think it's wrong to enjoy a slasher film. At the end of the day, I'm just like, if that's your point, I don't really agree with the point, because it's like, I don't think that there's a problem with enjoying other types of media. Now, that being said, having things like Twin Peaks that make it less disposable, it's cool to see, but I don't think you're saving the film industry. Like, I am a little bit at odds with that.
I think that the biggest thing that I can less so agree, but understand, I suppose I should word it as, is that the issue of saturation and how commonplace it can most certainly create counter art in which is going to try to challenge that and also speak on behalf of like the other side of it and something as the greater whole. Though I'm happy with the expression that is provided, especially if it is in terms of if this is truly the David Lynch intent, it still is something where I'm probably still, as you were saying, partake upon those slasher films and see what exactly that's trying to. In any form, we are experiencing so many multitudes of mediums and how that they are being presented that even the copycats, the mimicries, I feel that you can still squeeze some very nice insights and some nice orange juice of enjoyment from.
I want to be clear again that if you were to go through our podcast and identify all the faulty logic or bad points that I've made or things Professor said over all the hours, you can't even complain this video is too long, the 4.5 hour one, because 4.5 hours of our podcast doesn't get you through season 1. So it's like, I again want to emphasize that, like, it's hard to make these kind of analyses. I think the reason why we come out so clearly disagreeing, though, is that our podcast has had so many moments throughout this run, between looking at the books, between looking at the cards, between looking at the Gazette, that the idea of looking at Twin Peaks like, oh yeah, that's David Lynch's thing, feels so like at odds with everything we've been through. David Lynch is probably the most important singular person in Twin Peaks. Yes. But there's like 30 other creators vying for that title. Including his own daughter, who had a great story. So
I think more than that, it's just more so the fact that there can be one primary reading.
There is no the answer.
I do think that there's just many series of answers that become this wild multiple choice little fill in the bobble, but at the same time write the essay in between the bobbles situation.
What I do think is really cool, though, is that if you do check out that video, or you already have, it can provide a pretty interesting framework if you like rewatch Twin Peaks, because now you have these different ideas that you're toying around with, that you can view the whole show through these meta readings about electricity, radio, television, film history, and if you like apply that to the show, I think you can create some pretty interesting reads. I think it's a cool lens.
Fun read and like a very fun watch.
Yeah, 100%. So thank you, Craig, for that great question.
Yeah.
That was a lot to hopefully we gave you an answer there. I think meta readings have potential as long as we don't limit it to just that.
Yes.
Perfect. Theosis on YouTube asks, given everything, do you prefer season 2 episodes 17 through 28 or season 3? So just for clarity, episodes 17 through 28 would be basically the rest of season 2 after Leland dies.
Yes.
Including that kind of period that people find middling with the subplots, and also including Wyndham Earl's arc with Annie at the end of the series. For me, it's a really obvious answer. I prefer the original series, season 2, episodes 17 through 28, over The Return, primarily because even though there may have been some subplots I wasn't as in love with, again, James and Evelyn isn't huge for me, I still felt more of a connection to the atmosphere, the characters, and the through lines once we got Annie and Wyndham Earl in. I was more hooked, more interested, had more fun than I had in The Return. Simple answer.
I think that the difference between what I'm saying here is always which one is my favorite and which one do I feel stronger. If you ask me which one do I prefer, it's going to be The Return, mostly because it's something that I'm chewing on and enjoying. Meanwhile, season 2, I do think genuinely is stronger, mostly because I think that even though, yes, people see it as messy, it still is a series of all sorts of flavors. I find it to be a very nice plate of like candies that you'd see for the holidays that come with all sorts of varieties. Some are like heavily like rich and sweet, such as like those little doughy peanut butter cookies with Reese's cups in between.
Oh, they're delicious.
And some of them are a little bit more mild, but still have their moments and pieces, like those little pretzels, like those little curvy pretzels with almond bark inside of them, and little pieces of like M&Ms.
Those are good too.
In between them. Like they have their moments, but for the most part, like by their whole, you can get out a narrative. You can have fun with that narrative. And I think that you and I, other than like the one episode, very much vibe a lot with season 2.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a solid time, and I do think that it's a very sweet thing that if you haven't had a chance to re-explore or explore for yourself, I do recommend giving season 2 at least another shot, not through too far of the critical lens, but just more so what a show is willing to do, wildly do, and maybe jump the shark a few times, but sometimes the ride is just fun along the way. And again, I do prefer The Return, but it is still in respects that it is something for me to slowly chew on. It's like those everlasting gobstoppers?
Yes.
It's that, but meat flavored. It's like an everlasting gobstopper. You don't know why it is the way that it is, and it probably
should be
defies
illegal. It probably shouldn't be allowed.
But it's there.
I guess actually, you know what? As a vegetarian, if a gobstopper was meat flavored, and it made people not buy as much meat, because anytime they want the flavor of meat, they just put the gobstopper in their mouth and it lasts forever, I would probably be okay with that, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. It's a good thing. Bring on the meat stopper. I also want to say that regardless of what you think of season 2 and The Return, I think that I very confidently say that there were not many shows like Twin Peaks season 2 or The Return when they aired. Like, they're still some of the most unique and confusing media at the time they were released. I'm not super familiar with shows that existed in like the year 1991. I wasn't a human consciousness at that time. Mm-hmm. But I would imagine that you weren't going to find quite something like this. Yes, there were other soap operas and there were other crime procedurals, but the kind of thing that Twin Peaks was, even at what you might perceive as the lowest moments of season 2, was still something different and interesting.
Yes.
It was an experiment. And The Return, again, it's such an interesting experiment in relation to what had kind of become of television in that 25-year gap. You're not going to get the same thing out of Twin Peaks The Return, especially with scenes like the Hello, Johnny, How Are You Today, if you go put on Breaking Bad or Mad Men or other, like, prestige television-type shows. I don't know what else on, like, Showtime you could have found that would have done the exact thing The Return was doing. Mm-hmm. So there's something to be said, I think, for that.
Absolutely.
And the last listener comment we have is a hot take. And this is from McGuffin, a longtime listener who's left a lot of comments for us. Thank you, McGuffin.
Thank you, McGuffin.
And said on YouTube, my hot take is that I find James sympathetic. I don't hate the character. End quote. So I want to say that I currently find Donna more compelling. And maybe that'll change, but I think that the grave scene is so good. The stuff with Harold is really good. The Chalfont Tremont scene, she's literally the person that allows that scene to happen, and that's a great scene. Even the bad Donna stuff that's fun to make fun of in season 2 especially, there's still things to say. Like, she adopts part of Laura's persona into herself.
Yeah.
And like the way she has to navigate all those things, like in the diary, even how Fire Walk With Me has that different portrayal of Donna with Moira Kelly. I think Donna has more that I like to talk about and chew on. Whereas James, I don't really have as much usually to say. With his plot lines, I have less to do with it. And I'm just, even with The Return, I'm looking at him like, I feel like there's a little bit of missed potential with James in The Return. I feel all those things.
You know, the thing about James is, as with all things with this podcast, is complicated. James, as a character, sympathy is... You know those, like, old, like, CD-ROM games, like, you get, like, when you were a kid, when there was, like, a CD-ROM back in, like, the 90s, 2000s?
Like in the cereal boxes?
Like in cereal box sometimes, but more so, like, those edutainment games in which, like, people provide, like, the Arthur games.
Sure. I was going to give a shout-out to Roller Coaster Tycoon, because I got that from a cereal box
Yeah,
somehow.
no, this is not
That
Roller
was
Coaster
an incredible
Tycoon.
game to get in a cereal
This
box.
has nothing to do with Roller Coaster
That Captain
Tycoon.
Crunch game
This
was
is
also
edutainment.
really good.
Edutainment, not...
The Taco Bell floppy disk? You're bringing me back to my memories here, Professor.
Enjoy. You seem to be having a field of memories, and I'm happy for you, but I'm talking about the edutainment field, where you pop it in, you go through it, and you
like
go...
putt-putt.
Like putt-putt. And you play through your putt-putts or whatever you have, and by the end of it, you get a
Pajama Sam?
printout that tells you on how great you are.
Yes.
I feel like James has a printout on how sympathetic he is.
How cool he is, too.
Maybe how cool he is, and maybe he also has that, like, that cool little putt-putt thing, but for the most part, I think it's very paper thin when it comes to sympathy, or at the very least from my perspective on it. Because he does have elements with him that would lead to an end of sympathy, where... I'm saying that as like, oh, you have not got enough for me. You need to suffer more, James. No, he suffered plenty. When it comes down to James's story and character, he's someone that is neglected by his mother. His father's not exactly in the picture. And the father figure in his life, Ed, is occupied with all sorts of things that causes all sorts of issues. The big parts about James, and especially when he loses someone that he loves, when he's conflicted with his friend and so on, a lot of what James suffers through and what James has issues with has, for the most part, the biggest bits to sort of like find those points of sympathy and grow with this character have already passed and have not had much exploration. We even had a scene that dealt with James's mother, and though it may have been a short instance, and maybe it might have just been like a sort of like passing glance, regardless, that got cut itself. James is now responding in a world where he's already been hit with the punches. And truthfully, I feel bad for him, but I can't fully say that I feel for him as I do in respects of characters such as Laura Palmer or even like Dawn in moments, because there's not much to really explore James with his emotions, with James and how he is dealing with things, other than him lashing out at the world and other people. Like that one time he punched a lamp or a vase. I remember he punched something on his way out. We could, with James, explore more, but we just didn't.
I have three fingers up because there's three things I wanted to say as you were talking there. So the first one is like, as you're kind of leading, we didn't really get that exploration, and we could have. I guess my thesis points was that I think there's ways that James could have been explored more. I'm not going to go through all of them. I think one of the ways that could have been done was to have a more meaningful reaction to a lot of things that were happening to him. And a lot of it, I think, was not intentional. I think it was just that the show had to keep moving and they didn't, have that long-term trajectory. But like what happened with Laura, James was definitely shook up about, but because he got shuffled into the Donna stuff right away, I don't think we fully got the emotions of someone really being broken up about that. He buried a lot of that potentially. And then with Maddie dying, it felt like that was kind of an afterthought. Like I barely got a sense that he felt anything about it. And I no doubt believe he probably did. And you could say that that's the point, is that he buries it and he runs away from it. But I feel like I would need a little bit more to fully feel it. He never got a moment like Donna did at that grave. He just doesn't get moments to be fully emotive and get it out of his system. Second thing I wanted to mention was that the question originally said, my hot take is that James is sympathetic. I do find him sympathetic. If James was a real person, obviously, this was a confused teenage boy who had to deal with his girlfriend dying, and then like a week or two later, like his like girlfriend's cousin who looks just like her also dying.
Yeah, I don't think that I need to be present for like these girlfriend deaths to feel for someone who is able to communicate and emote towards me, or something that I hear about the person.
And presumably he would have found out that the killer was Leland, meaning it was the father, like all of these things that he would have had to deal with emotionally. Then, if that's not enough for this kid, he tries to get away from it all by leaving Twin Peaks, leaving this town. I don't even blame him. Why would you want to stay in this place? Yes, I know it hurts Donna, and maybe he should have been more mature with closure with her, but he's in so much pain and trauma from what happened. He goes, right? Then he gets wrapped up in Evelyn Marsh's, like, murder scheme, leaves that, and if we go by the Frost book, he gets stuck with the cartel. And this guy, by the time he winds up in Twin Peaks with the time of the return, he has lost every amount in him to want to explore the world, see things. He's just fine living a quiet life. It reminds me a lot of that quote from Carl Rodd in Fire Walk With Me, that he's like Ben places, he just wants to stay put.
Yeah.
And that seems where James is in the return. He is sympathetic, I feel bad. The other thing that was in that comment, though, is I don't hate the character. And I want to clarify, I agree, MacGuffin. I don't hate James. What I feel is that in a very large cast of characters from Twin Peaks, very large cast of characters, James would be one of the least interesting for me. Like, James tends to be in the story the one I am the least invested in and the least interested in. And that's not to say he doesn't have moments.
Mm-hmm.
If he was the main character, James would make a really bad main character. But in Twin Peaks, I think he just gets overshadowed by better characters.
Now, mind you, as far as items are concerned, I've viewed Twin Peaks in its entirety, and I'm sure that the listener, at the very least, that has been with us for a majority has experienced Twin Peaks. I don't usually offer hypotheticals that much because, again, I think that though you can most certainly try to refine and grow inside of the creative process, I sometimes feel like you miss the forest for the trees if you try to create a new reality far enough. I find myself, at the very least myself, I can easily get swept away so far that I lose track of things. So my mindset of being on this path and journey tends to be my primary mindset. I say that and preface that before I say what's next, mostly because it's a curiosity I want to spin off with you, Kalil, quick. When it comes down to the issues with James, also extends further into issues with Donna, in which I think that they're issues with each other. I've expressed this before, but I think it becomes more apparent when it, and this might go against like the ultra comparisons we've had with soap operas. I will fully admit to it.
Sure.
But if we like pluck away the romance, or at the very least put them into focus into other things for a time while flirting with this romance, truthfully, I kind of wish explorations with the character with James could have been together instead of like Donna approaching Harold and going on this journey. I kind of curious on a route with James, where James meets someone who is very important to Laura's life, and though there might be resentment at first dealing with the fact that like there could have been more romantic moments with this character, split away the romance and finding this person that's living with himself and trying to process that grief, and also spins off another person trying to get away from that grief without the distraction of romance. I'm saying this mostly for the time period. It's not to say that they can't get romantically inclined. I'm saying that it's less likely to be more apparent on television. But having something which romance is out of the way and it's more so focusing on these two people and their struggles, only to be met with eventually a loss of life, that he loses someone that actually had that final connection that he may have been missing, that he could compare himself to. I think that could do a lot for James as a character. I think that relationship and the loss of that relationship could do very well in the respects of not only pushing James in a sort of like light, but also challenging James for, say, for example, things later down into the season when he has to, say, for example, maybe confront himself and his own life past Laura.
Interesting.
It's something that I wanted to play with, mostly because, for one, I just don't like relationship drama with someone that is very complicated, but also because I want more from James and James to be challenged, which I think is mostly James is surrounded by relationships.
I'm not completely sold because I liked Donna with Harold, and I guess I wouldn't want to change that dynamic too much. What I would rather have had happen is for the characters to be more self-aware. And I understand that they're written to be unself-aware teenage characters, but I wish there was more of a sense that at least one of them understood this is wrong. And I kind of think it should have been James. Like, I think that Donna leaning into James following Laura's death, I think makes sense, and I think we can swing it that way, that she kind of leans into James during this time of mourning and kind of realizes her feelings that had been there, especially when we look at things like the diary with how Donna and Laura had this interesting relationship when they talked about their boyfriends and everything involving that. It kind of makes sense that she adopts Donna adopts Laura's bad side. She also adopts James. She's always like kind of going back to Laura's ideas. But James could maybe realize that something feels wrong about this, and he tries to like wrestle with it. Have an internal conflict with it. You could still have them together, but have him realize something's going on. And then when Maddie enters, have it even be further confused, because it already is there. I just think, like, have James be a more self-aware character during it. Have him have moments where either he's talking to Donna, talking to Maddie, or I also like the idea of, instead of having go with Harold, have them kind of split up a bit. So while Donna's working with Harold, I think that James can follow up other leads, which would lead him to other people that Laura was involved with. Yeah. I don't think you're going to have like a whole entire segment like how there was a lot of scenes with Harold and Donna, but I think one scene with James and Johnny would have been interesting.
Okay.
Because Johnny's an underutilized character. James, we know, is a very good listener. It's a trait we see in The Return. Mm-hmm. I like the idea of James talking to Johnny and kind of we could see a gentler side of James from that.
Yeah.
And see a side of James that's trying to find the truth of what happened to Laura, because even though he's with Donna now, he still cares about Laura. Again, internal conflict. Mm-hmm. Have him talk to Johnny. Have him try to even interact with Josie. Could you imagine that scene?
Or even,
that'd be a dynamic we haven't seen before.
Or even the dynamic that deals with Bobby.
Yeah, Bobby, that'd be such a volatile thing. It was set up so much, like the explosive funeral moment, obviously the barking in the jail cell. What if he had to try to follow up on these other leads, even talking to Shelley, like having James kind of be a little unofficial detective while Donna's on the long case of Harold, I think would have given James potential to be on his own more and to be more of a critical thinker. And I think James just doesn't come across in the current writing of the show as someone who really knows what they're doing.
If you take like the relationships out from James, like say for example, all these sort of like romances that he's had, what is James? I think that he is basically just someone that is like this weird, like putty glue that is all over the place instead of being potentially himself.
And I think you could actually do something with it, again, with self-awareness and self-criticism. If James kind of understands this aspect of himself, that he does kind of act as someone adrift, trying to latch onto these relationships, but not having a strong sense of self, I think you can really highlight that by interacting with these other people as Donna's doing her own investigation. And I think you can do things there that'll give us understanding of why he behaves the way he does later when he runs away. You can make him someone who kind of knows that he's fragile. Maybe he's dealing with his own lack of confidence that he can help these people. Mm-hmm. Maybe the more he investigates Laura, the more he realizes he never knew Laura the way he thought he did. Maybe he feels awful about it. Maybe he's beaten up about it. Then Maddie dies and it's even more compounded. And maybe he leaves Donna partly out of selfishness, partly out of fear, but maybe he worries that if something happens with Donna, she needs someone who can protect her and he's not it. See, this already, to me, sounds like a James who kind of is reflective. I like the idea of this not poetic, but like sentimental biker guy who may seem like a quiet soul, but inside there's these things kind of churning. And there's an instability inside of him.
And even with that, if we go full unstable route with it, if we at the very least give him these challenges and he fails against them, and he actually does not overcome, and he's not actually progressing through them, instead they're slapping him in the face, at the very least it offers a journey and offers a larger character to James.
Yes.
So Yeah.
I'm sold on our fan fiction we just made up here. Thank you for the question, MacGuffin. I hope that we gave you an answer somewhere in there. Thank you very much. And a big thank you to everyone who's listened to these episodes, whether you've joined us recently or you've actually been with us for 3 years. Thank you so much for being part of this journey, for supporting us. You know, it's weird. Like we have these hours and hours, like you said, hundreds of hours probably.
Hundreds of hours that we had to switch even providers for our podcast because we have been going on for quite a bit.
And we looked into, you know, the views and everything, and, you know, we'll see that people are listening to this, and it's like, it's kind of amazing that we have, like, you know, 100 or so people who listen to this podcast.
Yes.
So thank you.
It's very humbling.
Thank you very much for joining us. And as we say goodbye to the Twin Peaks Logcast, if you still want to follow us, keep up what we're doing, we do have individually our own channels and methods of content. Professor, what do you do?
For the most part, at this time, I'll be upfront in the respects that I'm still trying to experiment around to see what I would like to do inside this realm of entertainment. At this current moment, I stream from time to time on twitch.tv at Unplugged Professor. But for the most part, you can find myself onto Twitter under Unplugged Prof. But we'll see what goes on beyond. I know I've been experimenting with a few things, potentially with Unplugged Professor on YouTube, but I do admit that the things that I crave are going to be a little bit different from the format that you're familiar with here.
Some things that you've had already done. I know you've playing a lot of video games.
I've
you
been
do
playing
voice
a lot of video
acting
games
works.
that deal with voiceover just
And
because I want
Fortnite.
to try to prepare. Fortnite has been a my brain is dead situation that I'm allowed to just sort of like let loose, but beyond that, my usual entertainment deals with my voice.
You might be going back to Final Fantasy IX, maybe?
This podcast may release around then. After then, the timing on that is iffy.
Perfect. And then I know also on YouTube you've uploaded like some D&D things that you've been doing, so that might be your future. That might not be, who knows?
I've begun dungeon mastering, yes.
And then for myself, you can find all things Kalil on the Snake Eye Dreams YouTube page. That is where I do a lot of the anime and film analysis. That includes Twin Peaks. I'm definitely going to be diving more in. Even just this talk of James. I have a video idea in my head. Making James cool. I'd love to make the video. But there's a lot of things I have on my docket. Some things random. I'm working on some stuff right now involving The Wizard of Oz, which is tangentially related to David Lynch, although I'm going to go a little bit in a weirder direction with that. I won't spoil. And also you can find me on Twitter through the Twitter handle we've always been bumping and talking about, at Snake Eye Dreams 1. That's the numeral 1, as in.
Through the darkness of future past, the magician longs to see one chance out between two worlds.
My teeth are bleeding! My teeth are bleeding!
God damn it.
My teeth are bleeding! My teeth are bleeding!
Help me.
My teeth are bleeding! My teeth are bleeding!